Welcome, fellow traveler through the shadows, to a journey into the darkest chronicles of the world's most dangerous city. Tonight, we explore every crime that Gotham ever produced, every depravity that its streets nurtured and its institutions enabled, every act of cruelty that its history has preserved in the amber of consequence and grief. So settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let your mind drift as we walk through the darkness together. There is no need to hold fear close tonight. Just let the story carry you gently into the quiet. Close your eyes when you are ready, and let us begin. There is a particular kind of city that does not simply permit terrible things to happen within its boundaries, but participates in them. That bends its architecture and its institutions and its cultural inheritance toward the production of outcomes that its citizens would, if asked directly, insist they did not want. Most cities contain crime, the way a body contains illness, as something foreign, something that entered from outside, and that the body's systems work, however imperfectly, to identify and expel. Gotham is different. In Gotham, the crime is not a foreign body. It is the immune system. It is the thing that the city's deepest structures were built to sustain and protect, disguised behind the vocabulary of law and order and civic responsibility so thoroughly that even the people who benefited from it most directly had often convinced themselves that they were merely unfortunate inhabitants of a place that kept producing bad outcomes through no fault of anyone in particular. Understanding Gotham requires beginning with geography, because cities are made by the ground beneath them and the conditions of their founding before they are made by anything their inhabitants choose to do. The land on which Gotham was built had a reputation for resistance that predated the city's formal establishment by generations, a history of failed settlements and abandoned projects that the people who eventually built successfully atop it chose to interpret as evidence of the determination required to tame it, rather than as a warning about what the ground itself might have to say about the enterprises placed upon it. The name itself carried a kind of ironic self-awareness that the city never fully acknowledged, borrowed from a township whose historical association was with foolishness, with the particular variety of communal stupidity that persists in the same error generation after generation, because each generation mistakes familiarity with the error for evidence that the error is in fact correct. The economic structure that developed in Gotham's early decades established patterns that would prove extraordinarily resistant to revision. Vast concentrations of wealth accumulated in the hands of a small number of founding families whose names would echo through Gotham's history with the permanence of architectural features: the Waynes, the Cobblepots, the Elliots, the Kanes, not simply wealthy families but dynasties whose relationship with the city was more proprietary than civic, who understood their philanthropy as a management tool rather than an ethical obligation, who gave generously to institutions whose continued dependence on their generosity ensured that those institutions would never produce the conditions that might have made their generosity unnecessary. Beneath this concentrated wealth lay neighborhoods of grinding poverty whose boundaries were maintained not through formal segregation, but through the subtler mechanisms of economic exclusion, inadequate infrastructure, and the consistent redirection of municipal resources toward the parts of Gotham whose residents had the political influence to demand them. Between these two worlds there was, in any meaningful sense, no middle ground. Gotham had always been a city of extremes, and the extremes had always served each other's purposes with the comfortable efficiency of an arrangement that both parties had reasons to maintain. The political corruption that hardened over Gotham's generations was not the corruption of individual officials making individual bad choices, which is the form that corruption takes in cities whose institutional health is fundamentally sound. It was systemic corruption, corruption as the operating principle rather than as a deviation from it, an arrangement so thoroughly normalized that the distinction between legitimate governance and criminal enterprise had ceased to be meaningful at the level of the city's actual operations. The Gotham City Police Department was perhaps the clearest expression of this arrangement, an institution that bore all the formal characteristics of a law enforcement agency: the uniform, the hierarchy, the stated commitment to public safety, while functioning in practice as an enforcement mechanism for the interests of whoever had accumulated sufficient resources to purchase its cooperation. This was not a secret. It was known by every resident of Gotham's poorer neighborhoods who had ever needed the police and discovered that need was insufficient justification for response. It was known by every criminal organization that paid its tribute to the right commanders and found itself thereafter operating with a latitude that official policy could not acknowledge and did not need to. The corruption was so pervasive that the honest officers who existed within the department, and they did exist, surviving through a combination of stubbornness and careful positioning, functioned less as evidence that the institution was capable of reform than as camouflage that allowed the institution to represent itself as reformable while remaining essentially unchanged. The architecture of Gotham expressed its values with the unself-conscious honesty that architecture always brings to the values of the people who commission it. The civic buildings were magnificent stone and steel of genuine ambition, Gothic towers and sweeping facades that announced a city serious about its own significance, that intended to be counted among the great municipalities of the world. The courthouses and banks and headquarters of major institutions occupied their ground with the authority of things that expected to be there indefinitely. But the residential neighborhoods of Gotham's poorer districts were built with the same frank communication of their inhabitants' status, the minimum sufficient to justify occupation, maintained at the threshold between habitable and condemned, updated only when the cost of not updating exceeded the cost of performing the minimum necessary repair. The infrastructure that connected these neighborhoods to the rest of the city was perpetually inadequate, the public transit underfunded, the roads maintained according to the political weight of the district they served rather than the condition of the road itself. Gotham's physical form was a map of its power arrangements, rendered in concrete and stone, legible to anyone who understood how to read it. What made Gotham distinctive, and what made the events that unfolded within it carry a weight that simple criminality cannot account for, was the particular relationship the city had developed with its own capacity for reform. Gotham had tried, repeatedly, and with varying degrees of sincerity, to address the conditions that produced its most visible pathologies. Reform movements had arisen with sufficient regularity to constitute their own tradition, each generation of civic idealists identifying the corruptions of their moment as the specific obstacle that, once removed, would allow the city's genuine potential to express itself. The muckraking journalism that had exposed police corruption in one decade had been followed by reform administrations in the next, which had been followed by the gradual reabsorption of those administrations into the systems they had originally been elected to dismantle. The philanthropic initiatives that had built libraries and hospitals and community centers in Gotham's most neglected neighborhoods had provided genuine benefits to the people they served, while simultaneously allowing the conditions that necessitated those benefits to persist unchanged, because addressing the conditions would have required challenging the economic arrangements that made the philanthropy possible in the first place. This cycle of reform and reabsorption was not the result of individual bad faith, though individual bad faith played its role. It was the product of a city whose fundamental structures were oriented toward maintaining the arrangements that sustained them, and that possessed sufficient institutional resilience to absorb disruption without transforming in any meaningful way. Gotham did not crush its reformers. It digested them, incorporating their energy and their language into its ongoing self-presentation, while rooting their actual impact away from anything that mattered. The city was experienced at this process. It had been practicing it for generations. It was into this environment that the full range of Gotham's most notorious crimes was born, not simply born in the sense that they occurred there, but born in the deeper sense that the city's conditions were necessary preconditions for their existence. That the same soil that produced the Wayne family's philanthropic ambition produced Joe Chill's desperation, that the same institutional arrangements that created Arkham Asylum's founding idealism eventually produced Arkham Asylum's institutional horror. None of what followed was inevitable in the strict philosophical sense that it could not have been otherwise. Human beings make choices, and the choices of the individuals who appear throughout this account were genuinely their own, carrying genuine moral weight that the social conditions around them reduced but could not eliminate. But the conditions mattered. The soil mattered. A city that had spent generations perfecting the mechanisms of its own institutional corruption, that had learned to channel the energy of its reform impulses into the service of the arrangements those impulses sought to challenge, had created the precise environment in which the worst of what follows became possible. In a city with functional institutions, with a police department that served its stated purpose, with an asylum that actually healed rather than warehoused and experimented, with a political class answerable to the populations it governed rather than to the financial interests that sustained it, many of the events chronicled in this account would not have occurred at all, or would have been contained before they reached the scale that made them legendary. The crimes that made Gotham infamous were not simply the work of unusually evil individuals operating in an otherwise healthy environment. They were the work of individuals whose particular varieties of evil found in Gotham's institutional landscape a set of conditions specifically suited to their amplification. This is not Gotham's excuse. Cities do not receive moral absolution by demonstrating that their failures were systematic rather than individual. The systematic nature of those failures is, if anything, the more serious indictment, because systems are sustained by choices, and choices are made by people, and people who make choices in service of corrupt systems bear responsibility for what those systems produce, even when they bear no direct responsibility for any single outcome. The founders who established Gotham's economic arrangements, the officials who institutionalized its political corruption, the professionals who normalized its institutional decay, all of them contributed to the conditions that made Gotham what it became, and contribution is its own form of culpability. What follows is the account of what those conditions eventually produced. The crimes that defined Gotham, that made its name synonymous with urban darkness and institutional failure, and the particular tragedy of a city that could not stop generating the worst of itself generation after generation. We will examine each of them with the attention they deserve, not the attention of fascination, but the attention of understanding, the attempt to see clearly what happened and why, to hold the horror without flinching from it, and without finding in it more meaning than it actually carries. Because the most important thing to understand about Gotham's darkest crimes is not their darkness, which is real and severe and not to be minimized, but their comprehensibility. They did not emerge from nowhere. They were not produced by forces beyond human understanding or human accountability. They grew from conditions that human beings created and maintained and could in principle have chosen differently. This does not make them less terrible. It makes them more important. A city that cannot produce its own monsters is a city that cannot understand why it keeps finding them in the places it thought it had looked. The night is long in Gotham. Let us begin to understand it together. There is a particular cruelty that belongs to ordinary evenings, not the cruelty of events designed to harm, not the deliberate architecture of suffering that some of Gotham's worst figures would later construct with terrible precision, but the cruelty of an evening that begins in the most commonplace happiness imaginable and ends in something that no child should ever be required to survive. The Wayne family's night at the theater was ordinary in exactly this way. Ordinary in its pleasures, ordinary in its texture, ordinary in every detail that preceded the moment when ordinariness ended forever and something else began in its place. Thomas Wayne had chosen a film that his son would enjoy. Martha had worn her pearls, the ones that would later scatter across the grimy pavement of Park Row in an image that an 8-year-old mind would carry for the rest of its existence. Bruce had sat between them in the theater, the way children sit between parents when they are still young enough to believe that the space between two people who love them is the safest place in the world. Thomas and Martha Wayne were not simple figures, and treating them as simple figures does a disservice to the tragedy their deaths represented. They were people of genuine complexity, as anyone who accumulates wealth and position and tries to do something decent with it tends to be, their virtues and their limitations so thoroughly intertwined as to be inseparable. Thomas was a physician, not simply a philanthropist, a man who had chosen medicine when he could have chosen any number of more financially rewarding applications of the Wayne name and Wayne resources, who maintained a genuine clinical practice alongside his philanthropic activities because he understood, in a way that many of his class did not, that the people Gotham's elite tended to help at arm's length through charitable donations were best served by proximity rather than distance. He believed in Gotham. This belief was not naive exactly, but it was selectively constructed, maintained by a man who had chosen to understand his city's problems as addressable through sufficient goodwill and sufficient resources, rather than as the products of arrangements that his own family's position both required and perpetuated. Martha was the fiercer intellect of the two, the person in their partnership whose assessments of Gotham's institutional failures were less comfortable and more accurate than her husband's, who had looked at the city's philanthropic ecosystem with a clarity that Thomas's deeper emotional investment in it sometimes prevented. She gave generously because she understood that the immediate need was real, regardless of her reservations about the systemic picture. But she did not give with the comfortable self-satisfaction that charity sometimes provides to its givers. She gave, as she did most things, with a clear eye on what the giving was and was not accomplishing, and what additional things would be required that giving alone could never provide. Bruce loved them both with the uncomplicated totality that children bring to loving parents before they are old enough to understand their parents as people, rather than as the central fixed points of the universe. He was 8 years old. He knew his father as the man who read to him at bedtime and whose hands were always clean despite the medicine they practiced, and his mother as the person whose approval he sought most completely, and whose laughter was the sound that meant everything was all right. He knew the Wayne name as the name he answered to, rather than as the designation of a dynasty, the social weight of which he had not yet been required to carry. He was, in the specific and unrepeatable way of 8-year-old children who have been well loved, still entirely himself, rather than anything that circumstances had made him. The choice to walk through Park Row on the way back from the theater was the kind of small decision that people make hundreds of times in the course of an ordinary life without consequence. The selection of one route over another based on some minor calculation of convenience or preference that is forgotten immediately afterward because nothing comes of it. Thomas made it because the evening air was pleasant and the alternative route was longer, and Bruce seemed to be enjoying the walk, pointing at things in shop windows and asking questions about what they were and how they worked in the way that children do when they are still in the stage of understanding the world, primarily as a source of interesting puzzles to be solved. The decision was unremarkable. Most decisions are. The ones that change everything rarely announce themselves. Park Row was what it was. It occupied that particular geography in Gotham's social landscape, where the distance between the world the Wayne family inhabited and the world that the majority of Gotham's residents occupied became physically traversable in a single walk, where the transition from the district that hosted theaters and restaurants attended by people like the Waynes to the district where people like Joe Chill made their lives could be completed in 10 minutes of walking. This was not unusual in cities. The proximity of wealth and poverty is one of the constants of urban geography, the two conditions sharing borders, because wealth requires poverty's labor and poverty requires wealth's patronage, and both relationships work most efficiently when the parties to them are close enough for the transactions to occur with minimal friction. What was unusual was how completely Gotham had naturalized this proximity, how thoroughly it had developed the mutual invisibility that allowed people on either side of the boundary to move through the same physical space without genuinely seeing each other. Joe Chill saw them. This was the element that Park Row's usual arrangement of mutual invisibility could not accommodate a man who was looking not for the Waynes specifically, not with any premeditation that transformed his actions from opportunistic violence into planned crime, but looking in the general way of someone for whom the world was organized around the question of what it might provide if approached correctly. He was not a monster. This is important to establish, not to diminish what he did, which was monstrous, but to understand it, which is the only way to understand why it kept happening after him and before him, and in the space between every pair of individual events in Gotham's long chronicle of violence. He was a man who had been produced by the same city that had produced the Waynes, shaped by the same institutional arrangements, except that where those arrangements had placed the Waynes at the center of accumulated resource and protected opportunity, they had placed Chill at the margin where neither resource nor opportunity accumulated, where each day presented itself as a negotiation with scarcity that the legal economy offered insufficient tools to win. None of this obligated him to point a gun at a family walking home from the theater. Constraint is not compulsion. People who face genuine hardship, the overwhelming majority of them, do not translate that hardship into violence against people who had nothing to do with producing it. Joe Chill made a choice. The choice was entirely his, and its consequences were real and permanent and catastrophic in ways that the moment of making it could not have fully communicated to him. But the conditions in which the choice was made were not his alone. They were Gotham's, and Gotham had been building them for generations before Joe Chill was born into them. The confrontation was brief in the way that all such confrontations are brief, compressed into the seconds that the production of a weapon creates between the moment of its appearance and whatever comes next. Thomas Wayne's instinctive movement toward his family was the movement of a father rather than a tactician, a gesture whose heroism lay entirely in its reflex rather than its calculation, an attempt to interpose himself between a gun and the people he loved that could never have succeeded and that he made anyway because the alternative was not moving. And not moving was not something the man he was could have done in that moment. Martha's cry. The pearls catching the light of Park Row's inadequate street lamps as they fell, each one carrying some fragment of the ordinary evening that had preceded this moment to rest in the grime of a pavement that had not been cleaned recently and would not be cleaned tomorrow. And Bruce, standing in the space between his parents' bodies, understanding what had happened with the full perceptual clarity that extreme trauma sometimes produces in the moments immediately following the event. The mind suddenly hyper-alert in the way of something that has just been required to take in more than it was designed to take in, recording everything with a fidelity that would prove both the foundation of everything he would later become and the source of a wound that would never fully close. Chill ran. This is what people do in the aftermath of violence that exceeds their own intentions. And whatever Chill had intended when he produced the gun, the outcome had exceeded it in ways that required immediate departure from the scene of its occurrence. He ran, and the night absorbed him, and the specific shape of his exit from Park Row would have been, in any city with functional institutions, the beginning of an investigative process that might eventually have produced accountability for what he had done. In Gotham, his exit from Park Row was simply the beginning of a long period during which Bruce Wayne was left alone with what had happened and what it had cost him and what, if anything, could be made from the ruins. Alfred Pennyworth had been with the Wayne family in various capacities long enough to understand Bruce in ways that the specific grief of the next days and weeks would make practically relevant. He was a man of military background and medical training, which meant he possessed both the practical knowledge required to understand what the boy who had witnessed his parents' murders was likely experiencing, and the institutional experience of having been around violence and its aftermath, in contexts that had required him to continue functioning. He understood, with a clarity that love made both sharper and more painful, what Bruce was becoming in the period immediately following the murders. He could see the shape of it in the way a person with sufficient experience of how trauma reorganizes personality can sometimes see the shape of who someone is going to be before that person has finished becoming it. His decision to enable the transformation rather than redirect it was the most consequential decision Alfred Pennyworth ever made, and it was made, like most consequential decisions, not in a single moment of dramatic resolution, but through a series of smaller choices that each seemed individually defensible and that collectively constituted a commitment whose full implications were never assembled in a single place, where they could be examined whole. He helped because Bruce needed help. He provided resources and training and access because refusing them would have meant refusing a child who had already lost everything else. He looked at what Bruce was becoming and decided that his love for the child who had existed before the murders was not sufficient grounds for preventing the emergence of what the murders had made necessary. The oath that Bruce eventually made was not the theatrical midnight declaration of comic mythology, conducted in a suitably dramatic setting with the full weight of symbolic inevitability behind it. It was quieter than that, and more disturbing for its quietness. It was the promise of a child who had decided, in the incomplete and absolute way that children decide things, that what had happened would not be the last word, that the world that had produced Park Row and Joe Chill and the sound of his mother's cry would be made to answer for itself. He did not yet know how. He knew that he intended to find out. The Wayne fortune, which had always been the foundation of the family's significance in Gotham and which now became the foundation of something considerably more particular and personal, represented a peculiar kind of inheritance for a child whose parents had been its previous custodians. It was, objectively, an extraordinary resource, the accumulated capital of generations of Wayne enterprise, managed by trustees who understood their obligation as the preservation and proper deployment of a legacy, rather than the service of any individual's idiosyncratic intentions. It would, over the decades that followed, become something that no trustee had anticipated when they accepted their obligation. The financing mechanism for a campaign of psychological warfare against the city that had produced Crime Alley, designed and implemented by the child who had stood in that alley and decided that he was going to make it answer. The years between the murders and Bruce Wayne's return to Gotham as something genuinely other than the person he had been are years of systematic self-construction, of a grief so comprehensive that it had converted itself, through the specific alchemy of an extraordinary will applied to an extraordinary wound, into a methodology. He had sought instruction from people who understood things that Gotham's conventional education could not teach him: the mechanics of fear as a psychological tool, the techniques of disappearance and concealment that transformed vulnerability into apparent invincibility, the physical disciplines that converted the raw fact of a human body into something capable of sustaining the demands of what he intended. The training was real and severe, and produced real and severe results, not just in terms of physical capability, but in terms of the progressive distance between the child who had loved his parents in the theater and the figure who returned to Gotham, having decided what he was going to do with everything that had happened since. The murder of Thomas and Martha Wayne was not Gotham's most depraved crime. It was, as these things are measured, a street robbery that became a double homicide through the mechanisms of a desperate man's panic and a father's futile protective instinct. It was common, in the sense that Gotham's streets produced similar outcomes regularly, in most cases leaving behind grief that had no theatrical dimensions and no transformative consequences for the city that had enabled it. What made the Wayne murders singular was not their nature, but their product, the specific personality they broke in the specific way they broke it, leaving behind a combination of resources and wound and will that would shape Gotham for the next several decades in ways that neither Joe Chill nor the city that made him could have anticipated. Crime Alley was not the origin of Gotham's darkness. The darkness was considerably older than one evening in Park Row. But it was the origin of the particular story that this account traces, the wound from which everything that followed eventually bled, the moment that connected a city's long history of institutional failure to the specific human consequences of that failure, in a form that would prove impossible to ignore. The pearls are still there, in memory if not in fact, scattered across the pavement, each one a small piece of an ordinary evening that a child carried into everything he subsequently became. The Elizabeth Arkham Asylum for the criminally insane was built on a principle that its founder considered self-evident, and that the subsequent history of the institution would spend generations disproving with the comprehensive thoroughness of a demonstration designed to be impossible to misunderstand. The principle was simple and genuinely humanitarian, that madness was not a moral condition requiring punishment, but a medical one requiring treatment, and that a person whose mind had fractured under the pressures of biology or circumstance or trauma deserved compassionate, professional attention, rather than the cell and the chain that preceding centuries had offered as their primary therapeutic tools. Amadeus Arkham believed this with the sincerity of a man whose professional training and personal experience had combined to make it feel not simply theoretically correct, but urgently, practically necessary, a truth that the civilized world had been unconscionably slow to act upon, and that he intended to act upon himself. He was not wrong about the principle. This is important to establish because the story of Arkham Asylum is sometimes told as though the corruption of its mission was implicit in the mission from the beginning, as though the desire to treat rather than simply contain was itself naive or dangerous. It was not. The desire was correct. The approach was genuinely more humane than what it replaced. The early years of the institution produced real recoveries, real improvements in the conditions of people who would otherwise have spent their lives in circumstances that were simply cruel. And the dismissal of this as irrelevant to the institution's larger history would be its own form of dishonesty. Amadeus Arkham was not a fool who failed to see what his compassion would produce. He was a person who was right about something important and who could not have foreseen, from where he stood at the institution's founding, the specific mechanisms by which right things can become wrong ones when they are placed inside institutional structures that are not right themselves. The building he commissioned was an expression of his philosophy in physical form. The architects he employed were given instructions that emphasized space and light, and the incorporation of natural elements that contemporary psychiatric theory suggested were beneficial to the recovery of fractured minds. The common areas were large and intended for genuine social interaction, rather than the supervised containment that passed for programming in the institutions Arkham was explicitly attempting to improve upon. Individual rooms rather than cells, because dignity was not a privilege to be earned by demonstrating mental health, but a precondition of the environment that mental health required. The Gothic revival aesthetic that gave the building its most recognizable visual characteristic was intended not as a gesture toward the dungeons and towers that the word Gothic might suggest to an unsympathetic reader, but as an evocation of the great monastic traditions of sanctuary and scholarship, places where the troubled soul had historically found both protection and the resources for genuine contemplation and healing. The early years justified the investment in the founding vision with a consistency that attracted the attention of the broader psychiatric community. Physicians and researchers who shared Arkham's therapeutic commitments found in his institution a place where the work they believed in could be done with the support and the resources and the professional culture that it required. The staff he assembled in those early years reflected the optimism of the enterprise people who had chosen psychiatry at a moment when psychiatry was genuinely beginning to develop the tools to address conditions it had previously managed rather than treated, who believed they were participating in something that would permanently improve the relationship between medicine and mental illness. Success, as it tends to do, produced the conditions for its own undoing. The reputation that Arkham Asylum developed through its genuine early achievements created pressures and opportunities that the institution's governance was not designed to resist. The first came in the form of patients whose conditions exceeded the therapeutic capabilities of even the most advanced contemporary psychiatric practice. People whose presentations were severe enough that what Arkham could offer them was not treatment in any meaningful sense, but extended management of conditions that had not yet yielded to the available treatments. The humane response to this situation, the acknowledgement that some people needed care that the institution could not fully provide, combined with the development of relationships with other facilities that might better serve specific needs, was available as a choice. The choice that was made instead was the decision to accept these patients and retain them, justified as an act of mercy for people who had nowhere else to go, but functionally representing a shift in the institution's population toward a category of resident whose presence would gradually change the institution's understanding of its own purpose. Amadeus Arkham's personal descent followed a trajectory that made him the institution's most instructive early case study, which is to say a case study that nobody at the time would have been willing to acknowledge as such, because acknowledging it would have required confronting implications that the institution was not prepared to address. Martin Hawkins, the patient whose treatment became the mechanism of Arkham's unmaking, was a serial killer whose crimes had included the murders of Arkham's own wife and daughter, a biographical detail that should have been immediately disqualifying as grounds for the therapeutic relationship that Arkham nonetheless insisted on establishing. His insistence was not simply a failure of professional judgment, though it was certainly that. It was the expression of something more complex and more human, the need to understand, to find in proximity to the thing that had destroyed his happiness some explanation that would make it meaningful rather than simply arbitrary, to convert his grief into knowledge that might protect other people from similar losses. The sessions with Hawkins eroded Arkham's professional distance in the gradual way that extended exposure to a particular kind of mind can erode the person who studies it, not through any supernatural mechanism, but through the entirely comprehensible process by which sustained attention to darkness changes the person who sustains it. He began to think in Hawkins's categories, to understand Hawkins's logic with an intimacy that was professionally necessary and personally catastrophic, to find himself capable of making arguments from Hawkins's position with a fluency that should have alarmed him and that he interpreted instead as evidence of therapeutic progress. The line between understanding a patient and becoming a patient is one that the therapeutic relationship was specifically designed to maintain, and Arkham crossed it by degrees so small that he did not recognize each crossing as a crossing until he was somewhere he could not easily return from. The physical deterioration of the asylum's fabric, beginning in the period following Arkham's decline and accelerating through the subsequent decades as budgetary constraints and deferred maintenance compounded each other, was the external expression of the institution's internal transformation. The plumbing that leaked, and the electrical systems that failed, and the masonry that crumbled were not simply the consequences of inadequate funding, though inadequate funding contributed. They were the physical equivalent of the moral deterioration occurring simultaneously in the institution's governance and practice. Each visible sign of neglect on the building's exterior corresponding to something less visible but equally significant happening to the people inside it. The Gothic architecture that had been intended to inspire sanctuary became, as its elegance gave way to decrepitude, a vocabulary of dread. Its towers and arched windows and stone corridors acquiring the atmosphere of a place that had decided what it was going to be, regardless of what it had been intended to become. The hiring practices that evolved through the middle period of Arkham's history replaced the therapeutic professionals of the founding era with a different kind of staff, not through any single decision, but through the accumulated logic of an institution that was becoming something it could not acknowledge being. Qualified psychiatrists and psychologists found themselves working in conditions that deteriorated faster than any individual professional could compensate for, alongside colleagues whose approaches to patient care were incompatible with the therapeutic principles that had originally drawn them to the work. Under administrative pressure that prioritized operational efficiency over clinical outcomes, they left, or they stayed and adapted. And the adaptation required by the Arkham of the institution's middle years was an adaptation towards something that the Arkham of the founding years would not have recognized as medicine. The guards who filled the spaces created by departing therapeutic staff brought with them the institutional culture of the correctional system, rather than the psychiatric one, an understanding of their role as the management of dangerous individuals, rather than the support of people seeking recovery. The power differential that existed between staff and patients in any institutional setting was present in Arkham as it was everywhere. But where a functioning therapeutic institution was designed to manage that differential carefully, to prevent it from being expressed through the petty cruelties that power over vulnerable people invites, Arkham's deteriorating governance created conditions where those cruelties found expression without meaningful consequence. The orderlies who supplemented their income through contraband trade, the guards who used their authority as an outlet for impulses that the surrounding society had not provided legitimate channels to express, the administrative staff who found it increasingly difficult to distinguish between their responsibility to the institution and their responsibility to the patients the institution was supposed to serve. All of them were both produced by the institution's decline and contributing factors to its continuation. Quincy Sharp's eventual administration of Arkham Asylum represented the end point of the trajectory that Amadeus Arkham's founding vision had, through the specific mechanisms of institutional decay, been describing all along. Sharp was not a physician. He was an administrator, a man whose understanding of the institution was organized entirely around the question of its operational sustainability rather than its clinical purpose, whose career had been built on the identification of inefficiencies and the implementation of cost reduction measures that were neutral in themselves, but deeply not neutral when applied in a setting where the thing being made more efficient was the provision of care to people who needed it. He accepted government contracts that brought Gotham's most dangerous criminals into an institution whose therapeutic infrastructure was wholly inadequate to address their needs, because the contracts generated revenue, and the revenue allowed the institution to continue operating, and the continuation of operations was the metric by which his performance was assessed. The research conducted within Arkham's walls, under the governance of the Sharp era and the periods that followed it, was research in the sense that it produced data, and the data was analyzed, and conclusions were drawn from the pedigree. Analysis. It was not research in any sense that the founding generation of the institution's medical staff would have recognized as consistent with their professional obligations or their ethical commitments. The captive population of the asylum provided researchers with access to subjects whose circumstances made meaningful consent essentially impossible, whose condition could be manipulated through the administration of experimental compounds under the cover of therapeutic treatment, whose responses to psychological interventions could be documented without the ethical constraints that governed research conducted in environments where the subjects possessed meaningful alternatives to participation. The outcomes of this research were not advances in the treatment of the conditions that had brought its subjects to the asylum in the first place. They were advances in the understanding of how to produce specific psychological states in captive populations, how to increase compliance and decrease resistance, how to map the architecture of human psychological vulnerability with sufficient precision to enable targeted exploitation. The knowledge generated was real and in some cases sophisticated. Its applications had nothing to do with healing. Arkham Asylum, in the period of its full corruption, was not simply a bad institution in the way that institutions sometimes become bad through the accumulated failings of individual actors. It was an anti-institution, a structure that had preserved the form of its therapeutic purpose while inverting its substance, that used the language of care to conduct harm, and the architecture of sanctuary to serve as a trap. The patients who moved through it in this period, including some of the most dangerous individuals that Gotham's institutional history produced, were not simply failed by it. They were processed by it in ways that made them more dangerous, more traumatized, more thoroughly organized around the pathologies that had brought them there. Because those pathologies were the raw material that Arkham's actual function required, rather than the conditions its stated function was supposed to address. The tragic circularity of what Arkham eventually became an institution that created and sustained and amplified the very conditions it claimed to be addressing was not invisible to the people who looked at it carefully. External oversight bodies that investigated specific incidents found evidence of serious problems and produced reports that generated temporary attention and permanent inaction. Journalists who gained access to the institution's internal operations described conditions that should have produced scandal and instead produced a news cycle and then silence. The political will to fundamentally reform or replace the institution was consistently absent because the institution served too many purposes for too many interests, for the disruption of reform to be attractive to anyone with sufficient power to implement it. The building still stands, after every assault on its structure, after every occasion on which it should by rights have ceased to function, after every reason the world has given it to become the ruin that its deteriorating fabric suggests it is in the process of becoming. It stands because it serves. The crime of Arkham Asylum is not any single act committed within its walls, though the acts are real and severe. It is the institution itself, the continuous decision to maintain a structure whose purpose has been so thoroughly corrupted as to make its therapeutic claims a form of fraud, a sustained act of institutional dishonesty conducted against the most vulnerable. People that Gotham produces, in the name of the most generous impulse that Gotham has ever managed to organize into a building. Amadeus Arkham wanted to heal. What he built eventually became the opposite of healing. The distance between those two outcomes is the distance that runs through every major story in this account. The gap between what is intended and what is produced, between the stated purpose and the actual one, between what Gotham claims to be and what it demonstrably is. The man who fell into the chemical vat at Ace Chemicals was not yet a monster. This is the crucial thing to establish before anything else about him, because the story of what he became is incomprehensible without a clear understanding of what he was before the chemistry of that moment reorganized everything that constituted him. He was a man of modest intelligence and considerable desperation, a person whose biography, reviewed without the knowledge of what it produced, was the biography of someone who might have muddled through to an ordinary conclusion, continued penury, continued bad choices, the gradual accumulation of a life that did not amount to much, but that also did not amount to catastrophe. He had made choices that had brought him to the criminal enterprise that brought him to Ace Chemicals. None of those choices had been good. All of them were comprehensible within the vocabulary of human weakness and economic pressure, and the specific variety of bad luck that attaches itself to people who are not especially well equipped to avoid it. He went into the vat. What came out was something that the vocabulary of ordinary human characterization cannot fully accommodate, not because the transformation was supernatural in any meaningful sense, but because what it produced occupied a position in the taxonomy of human experience that the taxonomy had not been designed to address. The bleaching of the skin, the permanent dyeing of the hair, the damage to the facial musculature that produced the rictus that would become his most recognizable feature. These were physical facts of the transformation, real and permanent, and in their own way, descriptive. But they were the least significant of the changes the chemical immersion produced, the visible manifestation of something that had occurred at a level considerably deeper than surface appearance. The psychological transformation that accompanied the physical one was not brain damage in the clinical sense, though the chemistry of the experience certainly produced neurological effects that contributed to the outcome. It was something more organized than damage and more disturbing than injury. It was a reorganization of perception. a wholesale restructuring of the frameworks through which the man who entered the vat had previously understood the relationship between causes and their effects, between actions and their meanings, between the self and the world that the self occupied. The experience of the vat was an experience of dissolution in the most complete sense, not the dissolution of the body, which the body partially survived, but the dissolution of the organizing principles through which the body's consciousness had previously made sense of its situation. What emerged from this dissolution was a perspective. Specifically, and this is the detail that makes the Joker the most philosophically significant figure in Gotham's history of organized darkness, a perspective that was internally coherent, that had genuine logical structure, that reached its conclusions through a process of reasoning that was not simply irrational, but rather rational, in a framework so alien to ordinary human cognitive organization that it produced results indistinguishable from irrationality. When viewed from outside it, he had been confronted by the specific violence of what the chemical bath had done to his mind, with a recognition that he subsequently understood as revelation, that the meaning which human beings ascribe to their experiences was not a feature of the experiences, but of the minds that processed them, and that minds capable of ascribing meaning were therefore capable of ascribing none, and that the choice between the two was not determined by the nature of reality, but by the arbitrary preferences of the consciousness making the choice. This was the Joker's thesis. It sounds, stated this way, like the conclusion of an undergraduate philosophy essay, the kind of position that people adopt briefly in their early intellectual development, and then revise as they develop greater sophistication about the actual implications of thoroughgoing nihilism for the possibility of any kind of coherent thought. What distinguished the Joker's relationship to this position from the undergraduate philosophers was not its intellectual content, which was not especially original, but the depth of his commitment to its implications. He did not simply believe that existence was meaningless in the detached theoretical way of someone who had read the right books. He had experienced the dissolution of meaning at a level that preceded thought, in the chemical transformation that had stripped away the organizing frameworks through which meaning was previously generated, and what he had found in that dissolution was not despair, but liberation. The crimes that followed were not, or not simply, attempts to acquire resources or power or safety in the conventional ways that crime serves those purposes. They were demonstrations, each one a conducted argument in the language of violence and chaos, each elaborate scheme designed to force its participants and observers to confront the same recognition that the chemical vat had forced on its most famous product. The kill one to save many scenarios that became his signature were not sadistic games in the simple sense of cruelty for its own sake. They were genuine ethical dilemmas, constructed with considerable care and psychological sophistication, designed to reveal the inadequacy of conventional moral frameworks, when those frameworks were subjected to the pressure of conditions that lay outside the range for which they had been developed. When he placed people in situations where the principles they believed they held collapsed under examination, he was not simply being cruel, he was being, in his own understanding of what he was doing, honest. This is not an excuse for anything he did. It is an attempt to understand it, which is different from excusing it, and considerably more useful for the purposes of the account this script is conducting. A monster who is simply evil, who acts from motivations that have no comprehensible logic, cannot be learned from in any meaningful way. The Joker's significance in Gotham's history of depravity lies precisely in the fact that he can be understood, that his actions follow from his premises with a terrible coherence, that the premises themselves are not simply invented but are responses, however catastrophically misapplied, to genuine features of the human condition that conventional moral frameworks do not adequately address. He is dangerous not because he is beyond understanding, but because he is within it, because the questions he poses are real questions, even if his methods of posing them are monstrous. His relationship with Batman was the central dynamic of his post-transformation existence, the element around which everything else organized itself. He understood Batman with an intimacy that reflected genuine philosophical engagement rather than mere tactical assessment, understood him as the only figure in Gotham whose commitment to meaning and order was sufficiently deep and sufficiently tested to constitute a real counter-argument to his own thesis about the fundamental arbitrariness of both. Batman believed that order was achievable and worth achieving, that the imposition of structure on Gotham's chaos was not simply a practical project but a moral one, that the line between justice and its absence was real and worth defending regardless of the cost. The Joker's project was the falsification of this belief, the demonstration that even the most committed guardian of order could be broken into the same recognition that had broken him, that the difference between Batman and the Joker was not a difference in nature, but in the degree of stress that had been applied to each of them. He kept Batman alive because Batman's continued existence was necessary to the demonstration. A Gotham without Batman was a Gotham without anyone to falsify, and falsification was the entire point. This is the detail that makes his crimes against the people around Batman, the specific attacks designed to reach him through the people he was committed to protecting, comprehensible as something other than simple cruelty. They were experiments in the thesis. Each person who broke, each ally who was corrupted or destroyed, was evidence for the proposition that the commitments Batman maintained were not survivable indefinitely in a world organized the way the Joker understood the world to be organized. Harleen Quinzel represented the Joker's most disturbing success precisely because of who she was before she became Harley Quinn. A psychiatrist, a trained professional whose entire intellectual formation had been organized around the restoration of fractured minds to coherence, was not simply a person he had corrupted. She was a professional defeat evidence that the tools specifically developed to resist his kind of influence were insufficient to the task, that even someone whose education had explicitly addressed the psychological mechanisms he exploited could be undone by sustained exposure to his particular combination of charisma and philosophical challenge, and the specific intimacy of the therapeutic relationship he systematically inverted. The sessions she conducted with him at Arkham were supposed to be the institution treating its most dangerous patient. They became the patient treating the institution through its own practitioner, using her professional commitment to understanding against the purpose that commitment was supposed to serve. Her transformation was not simply a romantic conversion or a case of Stockholm Syndrome, though elements of both were present and real. It was a genuine intellectual capitulation to a worldview that offered, beneath its horror, something that the world she had previously inhabited had not offered with equivalent intensity, a complete consistency, a framework in which every experience found its place, without the cognitive dissonance that came from trying to maintain conventional moral commitments in Gotham's unconventional moral environment. She became Harley Quinn not because she had stopped being intelligent, but because her intelligence found in the Joker's philosophy a coherence that she had been unable to find elsewhere, and the cost of that coherence was the abandonment of everything that had previously made her intelligence valuable to the people around her. The Titan formula represented the Joker's attempt to extend his influence beyond the purely philosophical into the biochemical, to produce through chemistry what the vat had produced in him, fundamental transformation of the person who experienced it, the dissolution of whatever constraints the pre-transformation individual had maintained, and the release of whatever the dissolution revealed. The subjects who received the formula were not simply made more powerful in any conventional physical sense. They were made into expressions of whatever had been held in check by the organizing frameworks that the formula dissolved, their specific mutations reflecting the specific natures that Gotham's production of damaged people had left waiting beneath the surfaces of the criminals who volunteered for the process. The Joker infection, the blood-borne pathogen that would eventually reach Batman himself, was the literal expression of what the Joker had always maintained was his method. He infected not through chemistry alone, but through the sustained psychological contact that the infection required. The extended, intimate engagement with his particular understanding of the world that left marks in the minds it touched, whether or not those minds recognized what was being deposited in them. The personalities that emerged from infection reflected not the Joker's psychology, but the recipient's own repressions and contradictions, amplified and expressed, which was precisely his thesis, that what he revealed was not foreign to the people he affected, but internal to them, waiting for sufficient pressure to emerge. The Joker is not Gotham's most depraved criminal, not because his crimes were insufficiently terrible, but because depravity, properly understood, requires a commitment to something, a positive orientation toward harm, a preference for cruelty over mercy that constitutes a moral position, even if it is a monstrous one. The Joker had moved beyond preference into the territory where preference itself was understood as arbitrary, where the distinction between cruelty and mercy was one he could make or not make, depending on what the current demonstration required. He was not depraved. He was, in his own self-understanding, liberated, which is a different and in some ways more disturbing condition, because depravity can be understood as the failure of moral capacity, and therefore addressed through its restoration, while liberation from the categories within which moral judgment is possible cannot be addressed through anything less than the abandonment of the philosophical premises from which it follows. The Joker persists in Gotham's history not as its worst criminal, but as its most fundamental challenge, the question it cannot stop asking itself, expressed in the form of a man who found the question inside a chemical vat and has been conducting the interrogation ever since. There is a kind of knowledge that begins as a gift and ends as a weapon, that starts in the hands of someone who genuinely intends to use it for the relief of suffering, and arrives through a series of transitions that each seem individually defensible, in a form that produces suffering with a precision and a thoroughness that cruder instruments could never match. The history of medicine is partly a history of this transformation, of the tools developed for healing being redirected toward harm, not because healing was a disguise for harm from the beginning, but because the same understanding of how a human being works that allows you to repair it also allows you, if you choose to make that choice, to break it more efficiently than anyone without that understanding could manage. Jonathan Crane made that choice. He made it gradually, through a process of intellectual evolution that he would have described at each stage as a deepening of his commitment to understanding, rather than an abandonment of his commitment to healing. And he was not entirely wrong in that description, which is precisely what makes his transformation from Doctor to the entity known as the Scarecrow among the most genuinely disturbing stories in Gotham's long catalogue of disturbing stories. Crane's early career was legitimate in ways that are important to establish before the corruption is examined, because the corruption is incomprehensible without the legitimacy that preceded and produced it. He was a researcher of genuine ability, someone whose understanding of the neurological mechanisms underlying phobic disorders represented a real contribution to a field that had significant implications for the reduction of human suffering. Phobias are not trivial conditions. They are genuinely debilitating experiences that organize the lives of the people who suffer from them around the avoidance of whatever has become the object of their fear, narrowing the range of available experience and action to whatever can be accomplished without encountering the feared stimulus, which in severe cases means narrowing it considerably. The work that Crane was doing in the early period of his academic career, the careful mapping of the neurological pathways through which fear responses were generated and sustained, and the investigation of the pharmaceutical mechanisms that might interrupt those pathways, was work aimed at addressing this suffering. The patients who participated in his early research did so because they hoped to benefit from it, and some of them did benefit, which is a detail that his subsequent history tends to obscure, but that is necessary for understanding how the subsequent history was possible. The shift that began in the middle period of Crane's academic work was not a shift in what he was studying, but in why he was studying it, and that distinction is everything. he continued to work on fear. He continued to develop compounds designed to interact with the neurological systems that governed fear responses. He continued to accumulate data about how fear operated at the individual and collective levels, how specific fears were generated and maintained and expressed in behavior, how the relationship between a person's internal fear state and their external behavioral presentation could be mapped with sufficient precision to allow prediction and, eventually, manipulation. The content of the research was continuous with what had preceded it. The purpose had fundamentally changed. The change was not sudden. It followed the logic of intellectual obsession, which is the logic of a subject that becomes interesting enough to constitute its own justification for study, that stops requiring external validation in terms of practical benefit and begins generating its own internal momentum based purely on the fascination of the questions it poses. Crane had become fascinated by fear, not as a problem to be solved, but as a phenomenon to be understood. And the distinction between those two orientations is the distinction between medicine and something else. A physician studying fear asks, how can this experience be reduced or eliminated for the people who suffer from it? A philosopher of fear asks, what is this experience? What does it reveal about the nature of consciousness and the organization of human psychology? What can be learned from its examination that extends beyond the immediate suffering of its subjects? Crane had moved from the first question to the second, and in making that move, had also moved away from the ethical framework within which the first question was embedded. Because the ethical obligations of the physician are organized around the welfare of the patient, and the ethical obligations of the philosopher are organized around the pursuit of truth, and these are not the same obligations, and do not always produce the same behavior. The fear toxin that became Crane's most significant technical achievement was developed through a process that began in the legitimate pharmaceutical research of his early career, and ended somewhere that the pharmaceutical research had not been designed to reach. The compounds he had originally developed to interrupt fear responses in the context of therapeutic intervention could, with modifications whose technical sophistication reflected the genuine depth of his understanding of the relevant neurological systems, be redirected. Instead of interrupting the pathways through which fear responses were generated, a modified compound could stimulate those pathways with a precision and intensity that pharmacological approaches available before his research would not have permitted. The result was not simply a chemical that made people afraid, which any number of cruder mechanisms could accomplish, but something considerably more specific and considerably more disturbing, a compound that could be calibrated to target particular neurological configurations, producing not generic fear, but the specific variety of terror that corresponded to the deepest and most individually organized fears of the subject receiving it. This specificity was the achievement. It required understanding the subject's specific psychological architecture well enough to predict which neurological pathways would produce the most devastating response when stimulated, which meant that the effective use of the toxin required not simply a chemical competence but a psychological one. The ability to read the person who was going to receive it and understand them with sufficient depth to direct the compound toward their most essential vulnerabilities. Crane had this competence. It was, in fact, the competence that his legitimate career had been developing all along, the ability to understand how a human mind was organized around its fears, which fears were structural and which were superficial, which anxieties ran deep enough to be the organizing principle of a personality rather than simply a feature of it. The skill he had developed in service of therapeutic understanding, he now deployed in service of something that was its perfect inversion. The philosophical framework that Crane constructed to make sense of what he was doing, or more accurately, to make it feel like something other than simple cruelty, was organized around the proposition that fear was the most honest emotion, the one that cut through the self-deceptions and social performances that governed most human interaction and revealed what a person actually was beneath those performances. When someone was afraid, Crane argued with the certainty of someone whose professional expertise gave his position an authority that purely philosophical arguments would not have commanded. They were expressing something true about their deepest relationship with the world, their actual assessment of what was threatening and what was not, stripped of the rationalizations and social pressures that shaped their conscious self-presentation. To induce fear was, therefore, in his framework, not to harm the person experiencing it, but to reveal them, to strip away the comfortable fictions through which they navigated daily life and expose the more honest architecture of their actual inner world. This argument had the quality of sophisticated intellectual positions that justify doing something terrible. It was coherent within its own terms, and wrong in a way that the coherence made more rather than less dangerous. The error was not in the observation that fear reveals genuine information about a person's psychological organization, which is true as far as it goes, but in the conclusion that revealing this information through chemically induced terror constituted something other than assault. Exposure of truth does not become legitimate simply because the truth exposed is real. The methods matter. The consent of the person being exposed to the process matters. Crane's framework simply omitted these considerations, not because he had considered them and found them unpersuasive, but because his shift from physician to philosopher had moved him into a mode of thinking in which the patient's experience was data rather than the thing. The entire enterprise was organized around protecting. The mass campaigns that he eventually conducted against Gotham's population were where the private philosophical project became a public catastrophe, where the conclusions of one man's intellectual evolution expressed themselves in the suffering of thousands of people who had no relationship to those conclusions and no meaningful ability to defend themselves against the specific capabilities that Crane had spent years developing. The deployment of aerosolized toxin in Gotham's water supply, its introduction into enclosed public spaces, its use against specific individuals who had become objects of his attention for various reasons. Each of these was a demonstration in the sense that Crane understood demonstrations, a test of his theories about fear's relationship to social organization and individual behavior, conducted on subjects who had not agreed to participate and had no way of opting out. The social effects of his campaigns extended well beyond the immediate suffering of direct victims in ways that reflected his understanding of fear as a social force rather than simply an individual experience. Communities that had been subjected to fear toxin attacks did not simply recover when the chemical effects wore off. The knowledge that they had been vulnerable, that their own perceptions had been turned against them in ways they could not have defended against, that the experience of ordinary public space drinking water, breathing air, moving through the city's transit systems could be weaponized against them without warning, produced a lasting alteration in the relationship between Gotham's residents and their own city. The fear that he introduced chemically left behind a residue of anxiety that no pharmaceutical intervention could address, because it was not the product of neurological dysregulation, but of accurate information about an actual threat, which was the most effective possible demonstration of his thesis that fear was an honest response to genuine features of the world, rather than a disorder to be corrected. The parallels between Crane's methods and Batman's constituted the relationship's most disturbing intellectual dimension, the element that gave the Scarecrow a claim on Gotham's moral attention that went beyond his status as a simply dangerous criminal. Both figures had organized their approaches to influencing human behavior around the central insight that fear was a more effective mechanism for producing compliance than rational persuasion, that people who were afraid could be directed in ways that people who were simply reasoned with could not, that the manipulation of the fear response bypassed the deliberative processes through which people might otherwise evaluate and reject the demands being made of them. Batman used this understanding to drive criminals toward the choices that served his conception of justice. Crane used it to conduct experiments and to impose his philosophical conclusions on involuntary subjects. The difference between them was in what they believed the manipulation was for, which was a real and significant difference, and not one that can be dissolved by pointing out the similarity in method. But the similarity in method was real, And the Gotham that produced the Scarecrow was the same Gotham that produced Batman, shaped by the same institutional failures and the same fundamental understanding of how power operated in a city where legitimate mechanisms of influence had been so thoroughly corrupted that illegitimate ones seemed to their various practitioners not simply effective but necessary. The therapeutic challenge that Crane's victims presented was distinct from the challenges produced by most forms of psychological trauma, because the experience of the fear toxin did not simply damage the mind that received it, but challenged the epistemological foundations on which that mind operated. To experience your own perceptions as the vectors of deliberate attack, to have the relationship between what you saw and heard and felt and what was actually present in the world around you become unreliable in ways you could not anticipate or correct for, was to have something fundamental about your relationship to reality destabilized in ways that outlasted the chemical event that produced the instability. Patients who recovered from acute toxin exposure continued to experience elevated anxiety about the reliability of their own perceptions, continued to test their sensory experience against reality in ways that healthy consciousness does not require, continued to carry the knowledge that the bridge between their inner world and the external one was not as secure as they had previously assumed. This was not simply fear. It was a specific epistemological wound, and the therapeutic literature that addressed it was inadequate to its scope because the literature had been developed for conditions that did not involve the deliberate exploitation of the therapeutic relationship between consciousness and reality by someone who understood that relationship at a technical level sufficient to target it precisely. Jonathan Crane, understood fully and clearly, was not Gotham's most depraved criminal, not because his crimes were insufficiently terrible, but because his crimes were, in a certain sense, too coherent. They followed from premises. They produced the results they were designed to produce. They reflected a genuine understanding of human psychology applied toward ends that the understanding's original development was not designed to serve. The depravity was real, and its consequences were real and severe. But there was something almost impersonal about it, something that reflected the detachment of the intellectual who has moved far enough from the human consequences of their conclusions that those consequences cease to function as correctives to the conclusions. Crane did not hate his victims, he was curious about them. The cruelty was a byproduct of the curiosity, which in some ways makes it harder to address than cruelty that is motivated by hatred, because hatred can be understood as a response to something and therefore potentially redirected, while curiosity that has been divorced from moral constraint simply continues wherever the evidence points. Hugo Strange was a different kind of scientist from Jonathan Crane, different in his motivations and his methods, and the specific variety of harm he eventually chose to produce, but connected to Crane through the common thread of professional expertise, converted into a weapon against the populations it was supposed to serve. Where Crane had been consumed by the intellectual substance of what he studied, fascinated by fear as a phenomenon in ways that eventually crowded out his commitment to the welfare of the people he studied it in, Strange was motivated by something more directly recognizable and in some ways more comprehensible as a human failing the desire for power, the need to occupy a position of dominance over other people that his intelligence and his ambition demanded, but that the legitimate structures of his profession provided only inadequately. Strange was brilliant. This is not offered as mitigation but as a necessary component of understanding what he became, because his brilliance was the instrument through which his desire for dominance found expression, and without it, the expression would have been limited to the ordinary varieties of manipulation that people with his motivations typically achieve. He understood human psychology at a level that his legitimate clinical work had developed, and his subsequent criminal activities had refined, capable of identifying with remarkable precision the specific vulnerabilities that existed within any individual's psychological organization, and of constructing approaches to exploitation that were customized to those vulnerabilities, rather than generic, The generic manipulator produces results that are broad and often effective, but also often detectable and therefore defensible. Strange produced results that were targeted and intimate, that worked in the spaces between a person's defenses, because he understood those spaces better than the person who maintained the defenses did. His early career was characterized by genuine achievement in ways that provided both the professional reputation and the institutional access that his subsequent activities required. He was published and cited and sought after, occupying the kind of position in the psychiatric community that allowed him to move through the institutional landscape of Gotham's mental health infrastructure with an authority that doors opened for, rather than requiring him to force them. The transition from legitimate practitioner to something considerably more sinister began with his growing recognition that the power his profession gave him was insufficient to the ambitions that his self-assessment suggested were appropriate to his capabilities. He was the most intelligent person in most rooms he occupied. He understood this. The rooms did not always recognize it in the ways he felt the recognition was due. Organized as they were around hierarchies of seniority and institutional affiliation that did not always correlate with the actual distribution of intellectual capability. His fascination with Batman was the purest expression of this dynamic. The obsessive attention of a man who had organized his professional life around the domination of psychological space, finding in Gotham's most psychologically formidable figure the ultimate object of that obsession. The discovery of Batman's identity as Bruce Wayne was not simply a professional achievement, though it was certainly the culmination of years of patient observation and inference, and the application of his considerable analytical capabilities to a problem that had defeated everyone else who had tried to solve it. It was a personal victory in the deeper sense, the validation of his understanding that beneath every symbol there was a person, and that persons, however formidable their symbolic dimensions, were ultimately psychological entities whose architecture could be mapped and whose vulnerabilities could be identified and exploited by someone with sufficient patience and sufficient insight. What he proposed to do with this discovery was the creation of Arkham City, which was the most comprehensive expression of Hugo Strange's vision of what his capabilities were for and what the relationship between his intellect and the population it had been trained on should look like at the scale he believed it deserved. The proposal was presented to Gotham's political establishment through the vocabulary of criminal rehabilitation and innovative urban planning, framed in the language of progressive governance and evidence-based policy that was designed to appeal to officials who needed solutions to Gotham's criminal overflow problem and who were, in the tradition of Gotham's political class, insufficiently attentive to the gap between what a proposal claimed to be and what it actually was. The city's most marginalized neighborhoods would be enclosed, their populations cleared or confined, the resulting territory converted into a managed environment for the housing of Gotham's criminal and psychiatric populations in conditions that would, the proposal assured its audience, represent a significant improvement over the existing situation. The actual purpose of Arkham City was the purpose that Hugo Strange had been building toward through his entire career, the project that all the legitimate research and the clinical practice and the institutional navigation had been preparation for. He wanted a laboratory, not the laboratory of the conventional researcher, operating under ethical oversight and with the cooperation of consenting subjects, but a laboratory in the fullest sense of a controlled environment in which the variables could be managed according to the researcher's requirements rather than the subject's welfare, in which the population under study could be manipulated and observed with a thoroughness and a freedom from interference that the ethical constraints of legitimate research permanently precluded. Arkham City provided this. Behind its walls, Strange could assemble the population he required, introduce the stresses that his experimental protocols demanded, observe the results with the surveillance infrastructure that the facility's administrative apparatus gave him uncontested access to, and draw conclusions from what he observed that the conditions of legitimate research could never have produced. The population he assembled within Arkham City's walls reflected the requirements of his experimental program rather than any coherent principle of public safety or therapeutic need. The clearly dangerous were present because their presence created the conditions of violence and territorial conflict that generated the social dynamics he was most interested in studying. The mentally ill who posed no threat were present because their responses to extreme stress were informative about the psychological mechanisms that concerned him, and because their vulnerability made them valuable subjects for interventions that the ethical constraints of legitimate psychiatric practice would not have permitted. The residents of condemned neighborhoods, who had not been charged with any crime, were present because their displacement served the political purposes of the officials who had authorized the facility, and because their involuntary inclusion in a population of genuine criminals and serious psychiatric cases produced social dynamics that pure criminal populations would not have generated, creating a diversity of response to shared adverse conditions that enriched the dataset. The surveillance infrastructure that covered every inch of Arkham City was not primarily a security measure, though it was presented as one. It was the research apparatus, the mechanism through which Strange and his staff observed and recorded the behavioral responses of the confined population to the conditions he had engineered. The cameras and microphones and sensor networks represented an investment in data collection that far exceeded what any security application would have required, installed throughout the facility with a comprehensiveness that left no corner of the environment outside the observation network. Every interaction between confined individuals, every territorial dispute and alliance formation and economic transaction and act of violence and moment of unexpected cooperation was captured and processed through the analytical framework that Strange had developed over a career spent thinking about how human beings organized themselves under conditions of stress and scarcity and perceived threat. The chaos that characterized Arkham City's surface appearance was not, as it seemed to the outside observers who occasionally glimpsed what was happening within its walls, the inevitable result of housing Gotham's most dangerous population in an enclosed space with inadequate oversight. It was managed chaos, organized from behind the scenes by Strange's interventions into the facility's social dynamics through the manipulation of resource distribution, the selective enforcement of facility rules, and the occasional direct introduction of specific stimuli designed to produce the conflicts and coalitions that his experimental protocols required. He was not watching what happened when Gotham's criminal population was left to organize itself. He was conducting an experiment in social organization under controlled conditions, with the confined population serving as the experimental subjects and the appearance of unmanaged chaos serving as the cover that prevented them from recognizing their role. Victor Fries occupied a position in this account that is, in some ways, the most humanly comprehensible, and in other ways, the most tragic, because his crimes began from love and ended from the destruction of the capacity for love by the obsessive pursuit of the object that had originally inspired it. The story of Mr. Freeze is, before it, is the story of a supervillain. The story of what happens when grief finds a technological outlet and a person with sufficient intelligence and insufficient support mistakes the management of grief for its resolution. Nora Freeze was dying. This is the origin point, the fact around which everything else in Victor Freeze's subsequent history orbits with the inevitability of something that has found its own gravitational center and cannot escape it. She was dying of a degenerative disease that the medicine of their time could address in terms of managing its progression, but could not arrest or reverse. And Victor Freeze was a cryogenic researcher with a theoretical framework for cellular preservation that suggested an alternative to watching the woman he loved deteriorate through stages that the medical literature described with a clinical precision that made them no less horrifying to someone who had to live through their embodiment in a specific person. The alternative was suspension, the halting of the biological processes that were destroying her at a point before the damage became irreversible. The preservation of the current state against the hope of a future in which the medicine that did not yet exist to cure her might come to exist. The decision to attempt the procedure without institutional authorization was the first major ethical crossing, the point at which Freeze's legitimate research began to be redirected by personal desperation toward applications that his professional obligations and his institution's oversight mechanisms would not have permitted. He understood what he was doing in technical terms with considerable clarity. He understood less clearly, or understood, but chose not to weigh with appropriate seriousness, the ethical dimensions of what he was doing. The fact that Nora's suspension was a medical intervention of a kind that had never been tested in human subjects, that the risks were real and the protocols were his own creation, rather than the product of the peer review and independent verification that medical procedures require before they are applied to living people, that his personal stake in the outcome of the procedure made him precisely the wrong person to be the sole judge of whether it was appropriate to attempt it. The accident that converted Victor Freeze into Mr. Freeze was, as he understood it in the aftermath, the moment when the institutional opposition to what he was doing expressed itself in its most violent and most concrete form, a confrontation with his employer's representatives that ended in his immersion in the cryogenic chemicals that his research had produced, an immersion that should have killed him and instead changed him in ways that were survivable but not reversible. The cold that subsequently became his biological necessity, the suit that maintained the temperatures his altered physiology required, the physical distance from warmth and human contact that his condition imposed on every subsequent interaction. All of these were both the physical consequences of what had happened to him and the perfect external expression of what was happening to him psychologically. The freezing of a man around a single point of grief and determination that allowed nothing extraneous to penetrate. The criminal activities that followed were, in his own understanding of them, instrumental rather than purposive means to the end of accumulating the resources and the access and the scientific materials that his continued research on Nora's condition required. He did not want to threaten innocent people. He did not enjoy the fear and suffering his actions produced in the communities and individuals he targeted. He was simply doing what was necessary to continue the work that was necessary to save the person who made the work necessary in the first place. This self-understanding was accurate in its description of his conscious motivations and catastrophically incomplete in its accounting of what those motivations had produced in him and around him. The tragedy that Freeze could not perceive from within the enclosure of his obsession was the tragedy of transformation, so complete that the thing being preserved had ceased to exist in the person doing the preserving before the preservation could be completed. He was working to save Nora, the woman who had loved Victor Freeze, the specific man with the specific warmth and specific vulnerability and specific capacity for human connection that she had loved, and that had been the ground of the relationship. He was trying to restore the procedures he had undergone, the choices he had made, the toll that years of criminal enterprise in the service of an obsession had taken on whatever had not been altered by the cryogenic accident. All of these had converted him into something that the Nora for whom he was doing everything he was doing would not have recognized as the person she had agreed to spend her life with. He was preserving the possibility of a reunion that his own transformation had already made impossible, working toward a future in which the person he was returning her to was a man who no longer existed, replaced by something that wore his face and carried his memories, and was driven by a version of his love so distorted by the mechanisms of its own expression as to be something entirely other than love in any meaningful sense. The cryogenic preservation that had been the purpose of his research became, through the specific irony that characterizes the most genuinely tragic figures, the metaphor for his own condition. He had frozen himself at the moment of crisis in his emotional development, in his moral reasoning, in his capacity to recognize the relationship between his means and the end that had originally motivated them. He could not grow or change, because growth and change would have required him to look directly at what he had become and make a judgment about it. And looking directly at what he had become would have required him to understand that the person doing the looking was no longer the person who had loved Nora in the way that made everything else worth anything. These three figures, Crane, Strange, and Fries, represent different answers to the same underlying question that the corruption of professional expertise always poses. What happens when the tools developed for the relief of suffering are redirected toward its production? Crane redirected them through intellectual detachment, through a process of fascination with the subject of his study that gradually crowded out his concern for the welfare of its objects. Strange redirected them through ambition, through the need for a scale of power over other people that legitimate practice could not provide, and that his capabilities made him feel entitled to pursue. Fries redirected them through grief, through the mechanism of a love so consuming that it swallowed his moral judgment, along with everything else that might have constrained him. None of these motivations are exotic or incomprehensible. All of them are recognizable extensions of things that exist in everyone: intellectual curiosity, the desire for recognition and power, the experience of devastating loss. What distinguished these three men was not the presence of these motivations, but the specific combination of capability and circumstance and institutional environment that allowed them to be pursued to their catastrophic conclusions. Without the corrective intervention that a functioning set of professional and social structures would have provided, Gotham, as has been established, was not operating a functioning set of professional and social structures. It was operating the appearances of such structures around an institutional core that had been comprehensively redirected toward the sustenance of arrangements that such structures, if genuinely functional, would have challenged and changed. In this environment, the corruption of three scientists was not an aberration. It was a predictable outcome of a city that had perfected the production of conditions in which the worst possibilities of human nature could be pursued without meaningful consequence. There is a specific quality of evil that belongs to actions conducted not against strangers, but against people who were loved, people who were chosen, people who were placed in danger by the person whose primary obligation was their protection. The ordinary categories of crime and punishment were developed, most of them to address harm inflicted by people who had no particular relationship to the people they harmed. The stranger in the alley, the criminal enterprise targeting the anonymous member of the public, the institutional actor whose indifference to the specific humanity of its victims was the condition of its operation. These categories are real, and the harm they address is real, but they are insufficient for the species of harm that was inflicted on Jason Todd, because Jason Todd was not harmed by strangers or by institutional indifference. He was harmed by the most calculating intelligence that Gotham had ever produced, through mechanisms that could only have been developed through an intimate and detailed understanding of the specific person being destroyed, using vulnerabilities that had been created in part by the person responsible for his welfare. Jason Todd's life before Batman found him was a life shaped by the specific variety of deprivation that Gotham produced most efficiently, not the dramatic poverty of complete destitution, but the grinding, normalizing poverty of a child whose circumstances had produced survival instincts where stability should have been, who had learned to read the environment for threats before he had fully learned to read in any other sense, who had developed a kind of streetwise intelligence that was genuinely impressive and that had been developed at the direct expense of the ordinary developmental experiences that produce children with the social and emotional foundations for adult lives that were not organized primarily around navigating risk. He was not simply a troubled youth. He was a person who had been shaped by Gotham's most reliable mechanism of production, the conversion of children with potential into people whose potential had been organized by circumstances into its own instrument of survival. rather than into anything that the potential's original character might have suggested. Batman found him because Jason was stealing. Specifically, he was stealing the tires from the Batmobile, which was a detail that combined the audacity required to attempt something so absurd and the desperation that made the attempt seem reasonable into a single gesture that communicated to someone capable of reading it more about who Jason Todd was than any biographical summary could have conveyed. The combination of recklessness and need, of intelligence applied to a purpose that the intelligence was too well developed not to understand, was inadequate to the actual problem it was trying to solve. This was Jason, and Batman read it the way he read everything, which was with more comprehension of the tactical dimensions than the human ones, and offered him something that the tactical analysis suggested was a solution, and that the human analysis would have complicated considerably if it had been applied. What Batman offered Jason was purpose, which was real and valuable and genuinely needed. What he did not fully reckon with, either because he was incapable of the reckoning or because the reckoning was too uncomfortable to complete honestly, was the specificity of what he was asking Jason to exchange for that purpose. Normal childhood was not available to Jason in the way that it had not been available to Bruce at 8 years old, but the abnormality of Jason's life had not yet organized itself into anything irrevocable. He was still capable of the ordinary developmental experiences that produce people capable of ordinary relationships, still in possession of emotional architecture that had not been permanently bent around a single organizing wound. The training that turned him into Robin reorganized that architecture according to specifications that the training's purpose required, rather than the specifications that Jason's development required, creating in him the capabilities that Batman needed alongside the dependencies and the specific variety of psychological isolation that Batman's approach to partnership tended to produce in everyone it touched. The relationship that developed between them was real in its affection, even when it was flawed in its structure. Batman cared about Jason with a genuineness that his difficulty expressing genuine care did not negate. Jason loved Batman with the intensity of someone who had not had a great deal of experience receiving protection from people who were capable of providing it, and who had responded to the experience with the full commitment of someone to whom it was entirely new. These were real emotional facts, as real as any of the tactical arrangements that surrounded them, and they mattered because they were the specific emotional facts that the Joker subsequently identified and targeted with the precision of someone who understood that the most devastating way to destroy Batman was not to attack him but to attack what he loved, and to use what he loved as the instrument of the attack. The intelligence operation that produced Jason's capture was remarkable in its sophistication, which is to say, it was exactly as sophisticated as you would expect an operation planned by the Joker to be, when the Joker was operating at the intersection of his two primary interests: the falsification of Batman's thesis about the possibility of order and protection, and the demonstration of his own thesis about the fundamental vulnerability of any emotional commitment to another person in a world organized the way he understood the world to be organized. He had watched Batman and Robin with the patient attention of someone who was not simply observing enemies, but studying a philosophical argument, looking for its weakest premise, identifying the point at which the argument's emotional foundations were most exposed, planning the intervention that would reveal those foundations to be insufficient to the weight they were being asked to bear. The capture itself was designed to accomplish two things simultaneously: to put Jason in a situation where the thing he had been trained to do was completely useless, and to put Batman in a situation where the thing he was best at was also completely useless. Because the problem confronting him was not a tactical one, but a human one. Not a problem of insufficient force or inadequate preparation, but a problem of insufficient time and impossible geography. The Joker had arranged matters so that Batman would know what was happening and be unable to prevent it, which was far crueler than simply taking Jason and hiding him, because the knowledge without the ability to act was its own particular form of torture, the precise torture that someone with Batman's specific psychological organization around the principle of protective action could most effectively inflict. What happened in the warehouse over the months that followed was systematic in ways that distinguished it from ordinary violence as completely as surgical precision distinguishes a surgery from a wound. The Joker was not simply hurting Jason, though he was certainly hurting him, and the physical dimensions of what Jason endured were severe and real and not to be minimized. He was dismantling him, working with the patience of someone who understood that a person is not a physical structure that collapses when sufficient force is applied, but a psychological one that requires a different kind of attention, that the walls that protect a person's essential self are not primarily physical walls and cannot be breached through primarily physical means, but require instead the sustained and sophisticated application of the specific forces against which those walls were not designed. He took apart Jason's relationship with Batman first, which was the structural element whose removal would make every other element easier to address. He did this not through simple lies, but through the more effective mechanism of true things offered at the wrong angle. Revelations about the nature of Batman's project and the cost it extracted from the people who participated in it, that were not false, but that were framed in ways that removed the context that might have made them meaningful rather than simply damaging. He showed Jason what it looked like from a perspective that Batman's commitment to his mission made it genuinely difficult for Batman to show the costs borne by the people around him. The specific ways in which Batman's certainty about his own purposes made him imperfect at attending to the purposes and needs of the people his purposes were affecting. None of this required invention. It was all true, in the way that the Joker's most devastating observations tended to be true, which was the way that made them most difficult to defend against. Then he took apart Jason's understanding of himself, his belief in the qualities that had made him Robin, the courage, the commitment, the genuine desire to protect people who could not protect themselves that had made Batman's offer meaningful to him in the first place. He did this through the mechanism that the specific conditions of captivity made available, the controlled demonstration that the qualities Jason believed he possessed were not sufficient to the situation he was in, that the training he had received and the commitments he had made and the identity he had built around the role of Robin did not provide him with the resources to resist what was being done to him, which was both true under the conditions the Joker had engineered and not true as a general assessment of Jason's character, but impossible to experience as the latter when you were experiencing it as the former. By the time the recordings were made, the video documentation of Jason's suffering that the Joker had prepared from the beginning as a weapon designed for use against Batman, rather than as documentation for any other purpose. Jason had been reorganized, not destroyed in the sense of eliminated, because the Joker understood that eliminating Jason entirely was considerably less useful than what he actually intended, which was to return him to the world in a form that would continue the demonstration long after the initial event had concluded. What remained was a person who had all of Jason's memories and all of Jason's skills, and a version of Jason's anger that had been stripped of the moral framework that had originally organized it and given in exchange a focus that the Joker understood would prove devastating to everything Batman cared about. The years between Jason's apparent death and his return as the Arkham Knight were years of conversion, the transformation of a wound into a weapon through the deliberate and patient application of military training and ideological formation to someone who had been prepared for both by the specific nature of what the Joker had done to him. He acquired genuine military expertise, the kind that went beyond the combat training that Batman had provided into the operational planning and logistical organization and tactical thinking that commanding a military force required. He assembled an army, which required the organizational capabilities and the interpersonal authority that a person who had been comprehensively broken and remade often possessed in unusual measure, because the people who had been through what Jason had been through and had emerged still capable of function were frequently capable of inspiring in other damaged people a loyalty that less tested figures could not command. The Arkham Knight persona that he constructed was not simply a disguise. It was a genuine identity, assembled from the fragments of the identity that the Joker had dismantled and organized, according to principles that were almost, but not quite, the inverse of the principles that had organized his identity as Robin. Where Robin had been organized around protection, the Arkham Knight was organized around the demonstration of the impossibility of protection. Where Robin had believed that Batman's commitment to order was real and worth serving, the Arkham Knight was organized around the refutation of that commitment, around the project of demonstrating that what the Joker had demonstrated to Jason in the warehouse, that the protective framework Batman offered was insufficient to the real conditions of the world, was true at every level and in every application. The military campaign he conducted against Batman was remarkable, not for its scale, which was considerable, but for its intimacy, the way it was informed at every point by knowledge that only someone who had been Batman's closest ally could possess. He knew the safe houses and the contingency plans and the emotional vulnerabilities and the specific tactical patterns that Batman's training and his psychological organization had developed over years of operation. He knew what Batman was afraid of, not in the general sense of anyone who had studied Batman from outside, but in the specific sense of someone who had shared the space where those fears lived and had understood them with the intimacy of genuine relationship. The campaign was not simply military. It was psychological, designed at every point to engage the specific contents of a specific mind with the specificity that only prior access to that mind could have enabled. The question that Jason Todd's story poses to the entire account of Gotham's depravity is the most uncomfortable one in this chronicle, the one that implicates the figure who is most clearly the protagonist of this story rather than its antagonist. Batman's responsibility for what happened to Jason is not simple, not the direct responsibility of a person who intends harm to someone in their care. It is more diffuse and more difficult to assign, and for those reasons more important to examine carefully. He placed a child in a dangerous role. He provided inadequate preparation for the specific dangers that role involved. He made himself and the people around him into targets for his enemies through the visibility and the consistency of his commitments in ways that experienced military commanders who face analogous problems with the people in their command, addressed through specific operational protocols designed to limit the exploitation of predictable emotional attachments. He did not do these things out of malice. He did them out of the same combination of genuine care and limited emotional self-awareness, and the specific blindnesses that accompany a psychology organized around an immovable central wound that had characterized his approach to everything since the night in Crime Alley. This does not make him responsible for what the Joker chose to do. The Joker's choices were his own, but it places the story of Jason Todd in the territory that this entire account has been exploring, the territory where individual choices and institutional failures and the specific psychological formations that Gotham produces interact to create outcomes that no single explanation, no single attribution of responsibility is adequate to address. Jason Todd was failed by a city that produced the conditions of his early life. He was failed by an institution that had not provided Batman with the emotional tools to be the kind of mentor that the role of Robin required. He was targeted by the most sophisticated intelligence that Gotham's history of producing sophisticated intelligences had generated. And he was placed by the person who cared most about him and understood him least, directly in that intelligence's reach. The most depraved crime in the story of Jason Todd is not the one that the Joker committed in the warehouse, though the warehouse was terrible and real and permanent in its consequences. It is the accumulation of smaller failures, the city's failure to provide for the child who became Jason Todd, the institution's failure to produce the mentor he needed, the mentor's failure to fully reckon with the cost of what he was asking, and the Joker's choice to exploit every one of these failures with the precision and the patience of someone who had studied them carefully and understood exactly where each one was most vulnerable to the specific variety of pressure he was best equipped to apply. There are crimes that are committed in darkness, in the spaces between institutional attention and public awareness, in the gaps that every city's governance creates through the accumulated failures of oversight and the deliberate construction of blind spots that serve the interests of the people responsible for maintaining them. These crimes are terrible, and the darkness in which they occur is part of their mechanism, the condition that allows them to continue and to escalate and to produce consequences that accumulate over time in ways that the individual acts that compose them would not suggest if examined in isolation. And then there are crimes committed in plain sight, conducted through the mechanisms of official policy and public administration, announced through press releases and implemented by agencies with letterheads and authorized representatives who can be named and quoted and held, at least nominally, to account for what they have said and done. The latter variety of crime contains within it a specific quality of institutional arrogance that the former does not, a confidence in the systems of power that protect it from consequence that is both the condition of its commission and the most damning evidence of how thoroughly those systems have been corrupted. Arkham City was a crime of the second kind. Everything about its creation was public. The political process that authorized it was documented. The officials who championed it were named. The contracts that implemented it were signed by identifiable people, representing identifiable organizations with addresses and telephone numbers and boards of directors and shareholders. The displacement of the neighborhoods whose residents were cleared to make room for it was covered, inadequately, but not entirely without attention, by the journalism that Gotham's remaining news organizations were capable of producing, and yet it happened. It was announced and planned and constructed and populated and operated for the duration of its existence, in full view of everyone who might have been expected to prevent it, under the protection of a governance apparatus that had developed, through generations of practice, the institutional capacity to convert the appearance of oversight into the reality of permission. The neighborhoods that became Arkham City were not chosen randomly, which would have been bad enough. They were chosen with the deliberate logic of people who understood which populations could be displaced with minimal political consequence, which communities lacked the organizational infrastructure and the political relationships and the media access that might have converted their objection to the process into a meaningful impediment to it. The residents of the districts that were cleared, people who had been living in conditions that Gotham's governance had made consistently worse through decades of disinvestment and neglect, who had nonetheless built lives and relationships and community structures within those conditions through the exercise of precisely the kind of human resilience and adaptability that Gotham's worst tendencies worked hardest to eliminate, were presented with a displacement that was framed as temporary and implemented as permanent, conducted through the exercise of administrative powers that the legal framework technically permitted, and that the ethical framework of the society that had constructed that legal framework clearly did not intend to authorize for purposes of this kind. Hugo Strange's role in the selection and design of the facility was not fully understood by the political officials who had authorized it, which is a detail that says something simultaneously about Strange's sophistication and about the quality of scrutiny that Gotham's political class brought to the proposals it was asked to endorse. He had presented the project in the vocabulary of progressive criminal justice reform, using the language of evidence-based policy and innovative rehabilitation programming that appealed to officials who needed to be seen as addressing Gotham's criminal overflow problem, while also needing to be seen as taking a humane approach to it. The gap between what the project claimed to be and what it actually was had been engineered into the proposal from the beginning. The cover story, constructed with sufficient plausibility to survive the level of examination that the proposal would actually receive, while being entirely inadequate to withstand the scrutiny that honest governance would have applied to a fair, project of this scope and consequence. The political officials who authorized Arkham City were not, most of them, fully aware of what they were authorizing. This is offered not as exculpation but as an additional layer of institutional indictment, because the ignorance that allowed them to authorize something they did not understand was not the ignorance of people who had tried to understand and failed. It was the ignorance of people who had decided that understanding was unnecessary, that the credentials and the vocabulary and the institutional affiliations that Strange had presented were sufficient substitutes for the actual examination of what the project was proposing to do to the people it would affect. The governance failure was not simply that bad people made bad decisions. It was that the system had evolved to the point where the distinction between decisions and their appearance had become so thoroughly normalized that the appearance was understood as the substance, and anyone who insisted on examining the substance was treated as someone who did not understand how things were done. The population that was assembled within Arkham City's walls in the period following its opening was organized according to principles that had nothing to do with the therapeutic and correctional rationale that the project's public documentation described. Strange needed a specific distribution of types, the genuinely dangerous and organizationally capable, who would create the territorial structures and the conflict dynamics that his experimental protocols required, the psychologically vulnerable, who would provide data about responses to extreme stress that the clinical populations he had previously studied could not have supplied, the involuntary and innocent, whose presence among people who were neither would create the social friction that his theoretical models identified as most generative of the behavioral phenomena he was most interested in observing. He needed, in short, not a correctional population but an experimental one, assembled not according to the principles of public safety or therapeutic need, but according to the requirements of a research program that he had never disclosed to the officials whose authorization he had secured under entirely different pretenses. The territorial organization that developed among Arkham City's confined population within the first weeks of the facility's operation was understood by the outside world, to the extent that it was understood at all. As evidence of the inherent unmanageability of the population, the facility was housing proof that people like this could not be helped and could only be contained. This understanding suited Strange perfectly, because it provided the cover story that explained why conditions within the facility were what they were, without requiring any examination of the mechanisms through which those conditions had been produced and maintained. What was actually happening was more specific and more deliberately engineered than the cover story suggested. The territorial divisions were real, and the violence that accompanied them was real, and the suffering they produced in the people who experienced them was real. But they had been organized and in some cases directly produced by Strange's management of the facility's internal conditions, the selective distribution of resources that incentivized territorial control, the manipulation of information that created the misunderstandings, and the perceived betrayals that escalated conflicts beyond the points at which they would have naturally resolved. The surveillance apparatus that covered every inch of Arkham City was the facility's most honest feature, the element that most completely revealed what it was actually for. Security surveillance, properly understood, requires coverage of the areas and access points through which threats to the facility's integrity are most likely to emerge: perimeters, transitions, entry and exit points, the places where the boundary between the controlled environment and the world outside it is most likely to be compromised. The surveillance network that Strange had installed throughout Arkham City did not follow this logic. It followed the logic of research observation, which required comprehensive and continuous documentation of the subjects under study, regardless of where they were and what they were doing, capturing the ordinary texture of life within the facility with the same fidelity that it captured the exceptional moments of conflict and organization that the security rationale would have been sufficient to justify. The cameras were in the living spaces and the social gathering areas and the places where the confined population had, in the way that people always do in shared adverse conditions, attempted to create something approaching private space. The microphones were calibrated for the conversations that occurred when people believed they were not being heard. The sensor networks captured movement patterns and behavioral sequences that translated into data about how the population was organizing itself at every level of its social structure. The medical and psychological services that operated within Arkham City occupied a position in the facility's organizational structure that was simultaneously the most important and the most thoroughly perverted of its components. They were important because they provided the institutional cover that allowed the facility to maintain its representation as a therapeutic environment rather than simply an open-air prison with inadequate supervision. They were perverted because their actual function bore no meaningful relationship to the therapeutic services they claimed to provide, organized instead around the research requirements of Strange's program and the operational requirements of managing a large confined population with minimal genuine care investment. The physicians who worked within the facility, some of whom had arrived with genuine intentions that the environment systematically eroded, others of whom had been recruited precisely because their intentions were already sufficiently compromised to suit the facility's actual requirements, provided the documentation of treatment without the substance of it, the records of therapeutic intervention without the actual practice of therapeutic engagement, the institutional evidence that appropriate care was being provided, alongside the reality of a population being maintained at functional levels for research purposes, rather than served in ways that addressed their actual needs. The economic systems that emerged within Arkham City were perhaps the most genuinely surprising feature of the facility's internal life, the element that most consistently exceeded the predictions of both the facility's designers and the outside observers who occasionally glimpsed what was happening within its walls. Human beings, placed in conditions designed to eliminate the social structures through which they organized their collective life, consistently rebuilt those structures from whatever materials the conditions allowed, finding in the exercise of the organizational instincts that evolution had spent a very long time developing a resistance to dehumanization that the designers of dehumanizing environments consistently underestimated. The bartering networks and informal credit systems and specialization of labor that developed in Arkham City within weeks of its opening were not simply criminal enterprise, though criminal enterprise was certainly present. They were expressions of the same fundamental human need for participation in a functioning social economy that conventional society addressed through its legitimate institutions, and their emergence under conditions specifically designed to prevent their emergence was as clear a demonstration as the situation could have provided of the inadequacy of any account of human nature that reduced it to the capacity for violence and the willingness to exploit. Strange observed all of this with the attention of someone who had been waiting for exactly this data and who was finding that it confirmed his theoretical models with the fidelity of a well-designed experiment. He was not wrong that what he was observing was informative about human social organization under conditions of extreme adversity. The data he was generating was real data, and the conclusions he was drawing from it were not, in many cases, incorrect as conclusions. What was wrong, in a way that no methodological sophistication could address because it was not a methodological problem but an ethical one, was the arrangement under which the data was being generated, the fact that the people generating it had not agreed to generate it, that the conditions producing it had been engineered specifically to produce it, that the suffering that was the environment for the observations was not an unfortunate byproduct of necessary activity, but was itself the instrument through which the research was conducted. The precedents that Arkham City established for governmental authority over civilian populations were its most durable legacy, more durable than any individual research finding, and more damaging than any specific harm inflicted on any specific person within its walls. What it demonstrated, what its successful creation and continued operation demonstrated, in defiance of everything that the legal and ethical frameworks of the society that created it were supposed to prevent, was that a sufficient combination of public fear and political will and bureaucratic sophistication could produce conditions within which populations could be subjected to essentially unlimited governmental authority without the legal protections that the same society's foundational documents were explicitly designed to guarantee. This demonstration did not require that the precedent be immediately acted upon elsewhere, or that the specific mechanisms of Arkham City's creation be directly replicated. Precedents do not work that way. They work by establishing what is possible, by demonstrating that a certain kind of thing can be done and therefore will be considered again the next time the conditions that make it tempting arise, which in Gotham and in any city that resembles Gotham in the ways that matter most is reliably and regularly. The people who were confined within Arkham City, all of them, from the most dangerous criminals who had been placed there for genuine public safety reasons, to the residents of condemned neighborhoods who had been placed there because their displacement was administratively convenient, were people to whom a specific kind of harm had been done that was distinct from any harm inflicted within the facility by its population on itself or by its staff on its residents. They had been subjected to the exercise of governmental authority in a manner that was illegitimate in its application regardless of its formal legal status, deprived of the protections that they possessed as a matter of right rather than privilege, treated as resources to be managed rather than people to be served by the institutions that their taxes and their participation in the social contract had been supposed to sustain. This was the crime of Arkham City, the one that preceded and enabled every other crime that occurred within its walls, and it was conducted not in darkness, but in the full visibility of official policy, which is the most damning indictment that can be offered of the institutional structures that permitted it. The Guardians broke. This is not a surprising observation, stated baldly, because the breaking of Guardians is one of the oldest and most reliable dynamics in the history of institutions, organized around the protection of the vulnerable, the people who commit themselves to protection being changed by the break. Exercise of that commitment in ways that the commitment's original character did not anticipate, and that the frameworks through which the commitment was understood were not designed to address. What is worth examining carefully is not the fact of the breaking, but the specific mechanisms through which it occurred, the particular ways in which each person who orbited Batman's mission was damaged by the orbit, because those mechanisms reveal something important about the nature of the mission itself and the way it was organized around a central psychology that had not been fully examined. James Gordon had been a good police officer before he became the commissioner who cooperated with a vigilante, which is the detail that makes his corruption most instructive. He had arrived at the Gotham City Police Department with genuine commitments to the purposes that police departments were supposed to serve: the protection of the vulnerable, the enforcement of laws that represented the community's collective judgments about what behavior was acceptable, the exercise of institutional authority in ways that were accountable to the people that authority was supposed to serve. He had found himself in an institution that did not share these commitments in any meaningful operational sense, that had organized itself around different purposes, and that responded to the presence of people with his commitments either by marginalizing them or by gradually adjusting those commitments until they were compatible with the institution's actual operations. Gordon had survived the first response and resisted the second longer than most people in his position managed, which made him unusual, but also made him the specific person who was available when Batman arrived and needed someone inside the legitimate law enforcement apparatus who could be worked with. The cooperation that developed between them was built on a foundation of shared frustration with institutional inadequacy, the recognition by both of them that the conventional mechanisms for addressing Gotham's criminal problems were insufficient to the problems they were facing, and that insufficient mechanisms required supplementation from sources that conventional frameworks did not authorize. This recognition was correct. The mechanisms were genuinely insufficient, and the problems were genuinely severe, and the frustration that both men felt about this situation was legitimate, and the desire to find more effective approaches was admirable. What neither of them fully reckoned with was the logic of supplementation, the way that each departure from the conventional framework created the precedent and the appetite for the next departure and the next, until the accumulated departures had produced a position so far from the framework's foundations that the framework's protections were no longer available to the people who needed them. Gordon's moral erosion was documented in the gradual accumulation of things he was willing to look away from in the service of the cooperation that he believed was producing better outcomes than the alternative. He looked away from Batman's methods of interrogation, which were coercive in ways that were legally indefensible, and that Gordon knew were legally indefensible, and that he accommodated because the information obtained through those methods was often accurate and actionable in ways that legally defensible methods had not consistently produced. He looked away from the extra-legal detention of suspects, the destruction of property that Batman's operations regularly produced as a byproduct, the chilling effect on the constitutional protections that the cooperation was systematically normalizing as optional rather than mandatory. He looked away from all of it because looking at it would have required him to either end the cooperation or acknowledge that he was participating in something that his oath of office did not permit him to participate in, and neither of those choices was one he was willing to make. The psychological cost of sustained accommodation at this level is well documented in the literature on institutional corruption, which is substantial because the dynamic that produced Gordon's situation is not unusual. People who begin their careers with genuine ethical commitments and who are placed in environments that require those commitments to be compromised in order to function effectively do not typically abandon their commitments suddenly and completely. They compromise them incrementally, each accommodation enabling the next through the psychological mechanism of consistency, the need to understand oneself as a person whose previous choices were defensible, that produces the rationalizations that make the next compromise seem defensible too. Over time, the accumulated rationalizations create a self-understanding so distant from the original commitments that the original commitments are no longer accessible as correctives, because accessing them would require acknowledging the distance that had developed, which would require acknowledging that the accumulated accommodations were not individually defensible compromises, but a systematic abandonment of the principles that the accommodations were supposed to be preserving. Gordon carried this weight in the specific way that people carry things they have not been able to put down, with a constant awareness of it, a chronic low-level awareness of the gap between who he had intended to be and who the choices he had made had produced, that expressed itself in the fatigue and the occasional flashes of anger and the moments of doubt that the people closest to him recognized as symptoms of something they could not name because he had not been able to name it himself. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had been put in a position that the conventional vocabulary of good and bad was insufficient to address, who had made choices in that position that he would have judged differently if they had been made by someone else, and who had not found a way to reconcile the judgment he would have applied to someone else with the understanding he was applying to himself. The attack on Barbara Gordon was the moment when the cost of James Gordon's choices was transferred to someone who had not made them and had not been given the opportunity to understand what the making of those choices had produced in terms of the risks it created for the people around him. Barbara was intelligent and capable and possessed of the same genuine commitments to justice that had characterized her father's early career, and she had watched Batman's cooperation with her father with the mixed response of someone who understood both the genuine effectiveness of the arrangement and the genuine ethical problems it represented. Her decision to become Batgirl was her own decision, made for her own reasons, and it is not reducible to her father's influence or Batman's example, but it was made in an environment that had been created in part by her father's choices. An environment in which the vigilante model had been normalized through institutional cooperation in ways that made it seem like a legitimate option for someone with her capabilities and her commitments. The Joker targeted Barbara specifically because she was the most effective way to reach her father, and through her father to reach Batman, which meant that the attack on her was an attack conducted through the logic of the relationships that Batman's cooperation with Gordon had created. She was not simply an innocent bystander who happened to be in the wrong place. She was a specifically identified target whose vulnerability was a consequence of the specific social network that Batman's operations had constructed, a network in which her role as her father's daughter and her own role as Batgirl had made her visible and accessible and useful to someone who was looking for the most effective mechanism for causing Batman and Gordon simultaneous psychological damage. The physical consequences of the attack were permanent and severe. The psychological consequences were more complex, producing in Barbara a response that contained genuine resilience alongside the specific variety of trauma that comes from experiencing violence that targeted you for who you are in relation to other people, rather than for anything you did yourself. The creation of Oracle from the ruins of Batgirl was one of the most remarkable demonstrations of adaptive intelligence that Gotham's history produced, a genuine achievement of self-reinvention that the circumstances demanded and that Barbara's capabilities made possible in ways that would not have been available to someone with less exceptional intellectual resources. But the Oracle that emerged from that adaptation was also, in ways that the adaptation's genuine achievements made easy to overlook, someone whose relationship with the human consequences of the information she managed had been changed by the experience of managing it from a remove, whose omniscient perspective on the movements and choices of the people in her network created a form of psychological distance from those consequences that the direct engagement of Batgirl's work had not permitted. The surveillance network that Oracle maintained and expanded was a genuine and sophisticated intelligence capability that served genuine operational purposes. It was also considered from outside the operational requirements that justified it, a comprehensive monitoring system that covered Gotham's population with a thoroughness that the society's legal framework was not designed to authorize, that captured and stored and analyzed information about people who had not consented to being monitored and who had not been informed that the monitoring was occurring. Barbara's relationship to this dimension of her work was complicated by the operational necessity that made it feel unjustifiable to question when the question of whether it was appropriate to maintain comprehensive surveillance of a civilian population was posed in the context of an immediate threat to someone's life. The answer that the operational necessity provided was always that the surveillance was necessary and the broader ethical questions could wait. The broader ethical questions were still waiting. The corruption that extended through the police officers who cooperated with Batman, the medical personnel who provided assistance without asking questions that their professional obligations required them to ask, the various civic actors whose participation in the unofficial network that surrounded Batman's operations had been secured through combinations of admiration and obligation, and the specific kind of moral debt that people accumulate when someone has saved their life or the lives of people they love. All of this was the most diffuse and in some ways the most honest expression of what Batman's presence in Gotham had produced over the years of his operation. He had not corrupted these people through malice or through any deliberate program of ethical erosion. He had corrupted them through the simple mechanism of existing in a way that required their cooperation and offering, in exchange for that cooperation, assistance that they genuinely valued and that genuinely served genuine purposes, which is the mechanism through which most institutional corruption occurs, not through the straightforward purchase of compliance, but through the creation of arrangements of mutual benefit in which the ethical costs of participation are distributed into small enough increments that they are never confronted as the comprehensive abandonment of principle that they collectively constitute. The most important thing to understand about the corruption of Batman's guardians is that it was not incidental to his mission. It was structural, built into the nature of what the mission required and how it was organized and the specific psychology around which it was centered. A mission organized around a single person's wound, pursued through methods that required the participation of people who could not be told the full truth about what they were participating in, conducted in an environment that had been comprehensively organized against the possibility of the legitimate mechanisms that might have made the mission unnecessary. Such a mission did not corrupt its peripheral participants through accident. It corrupted them through the logic of its own requirements, and the corruption was, in this sense, not a failure of the mission but a product of it. As much a part of what Batman created as the cases he solved, and the crimes he prevented, and the genuine good that the genuine parts of what he did produced. The Nightfall Protocol was, among other things, the most honest thing Batman ever did. This is not an obvious observation, given that the protocol was a deception, a staged death, a manufactured disappearance, an elaborate performance of finality designed to convince everyone who was watching that what had ended completely. But honesty does not always express itself through literal truth, and the protocol was honest in the deeper sense of being the first time in Batman's public existence that what he presented to the world corresponded to what was actually true about his situation, rather than to the performance of invulnerability that the mission had always required him to maintain. What was actually true about his situation by the time the protocol became necessary was that the specific combination of circumstances that had made his particular approach to Gotham's problems effective had been undermined by the revelation of his identity in ways that no amount of tactical adaptation could address. The exposure of Bruce Wayne as Batman did not simply compromise his ability to operate under the cover of anonymity that had always been the foundation of his operational security. It destroyed the philosophical architecture of the project, the careful separation between the man and the symbol, the maintenance of the Batman identity as something that transcended its individual embodiment, the possibility of the fear that Batman inspired being directed at something larger and less mortal than a specific person whose biography and vulnerabilities were now matters of public record. When Gotham knew that Batman was Bruce Wayne, Batman was no longer what Batman had always needed to be. He was a rich man in a suit, which was not nothing, but was also very specifically not the thing that had made Batman effective as an instrument of the purposes it had been created to serve. The philosophical evolution that had preceded the protocol was not a sudden conclusion, but the end point of a gradual recognition that had been developing across the full span of Batman's operational existence. From the earliest period of his career, Batman had understood that his effectiveness was primarily psychological rather than physical, that the fear he inspired was more important than the force he could deploy, that criminals who might have defeated him physically were defeated before the physical engagement began because they had already processed him as something beyond the parameters of a problem they knew how to solve. This understanding had shaped every aspect of how he operated, from the costume that was designed to trigger specific primal responses to the theatrical approach to crime scenes that was calibrated to maximize the psychological impact on whoever encountered it. He was, in a fundamental sense, always more a performance than a person in his capacity as Batman, and the protocol was the logical conclusion of that understanding, the performance's most dramatic scene, staged with the full technical sophistication that the performer's resources and decades of operational experience could bring to bear. The psychological preparation required to arrive at the point of implementing the protocol was the most demanding thing that Bruce Wayne had ever done. More demanding than the physical training that had transformed his body into the instrument his mission required, and more demanding than the intellectual development that had made him one of the most capable strategic minds in Gotham's history. It required the systematic dismantling of the emotional architecture that had sustained his continued existence through periods when the purely rational assessment of his situation would not have been sufficient to justify it. The relationships and the attachments and the specific forms of investment in the future that had constituted his reason to continue when continuing had been most difficult. He had to stop being a person, in the specific sense of a person being someone whose existence is organized around the relationships and the experiences and the anticipated futures that constitute a life, and become purely an instrument of the purposes the mission required, which meant becoming the thing that the mission had always been trying to produce, and that the presence of Bruce Wayne underneath it had always partially prevented. Alfred was the only witness to this process in its full dimensions, the only person who had access to both the public performance and the private reality, who knew what Bruce Wayne was doing to himself in the preparation for what he intended to do to the world's perception of Batman's existence. His presence in this period was the most morally complex of all the positions he occupied in a relationship that had always been morally complex, because he was watching someone he loved prepare to eliminate themselves in the most thorough way available, not through death, which would have been simpler and in some ways less complete, but through the deliberate conversion of the self into something that did not require the continuation of the self to persist. He was watching Bruce Wayne choose to stop existing so that Batman could exist permanently, which was both the fulfillment of everything Alfred had helped create from the night in Crime Alley onward, and the most comprehensive demonstration of what that creation had ultimately cost. Alfred's love for Bruce Wayne was the most consistent and the most genuine of all the emotional facts in this account, a love that had expressed itself through 60 years of service that was never simply service, that had always contained within it the specific commitment of a person who had decided that another person's flourishing was more important than any competing consideration, including his own. He had made this decision when Bruce was 8 years old and kneeling in a crime scene, and he had never unmade it, had never found anything that the long years of living with its consequences offered that was sufficient reason to reconsider it. The cost of the decision had been real and accumulating. He had watched the child he loved become something that he did not always recognize, had participated in creating the conditions that had made Jason Todd's destruction possible, had maintained the infrastructure through which the corruption of people like Barbara Gordon had been organized, had looked away from things that his own ethical compass would not have permitted him to look away from in any context that did not involve his specific relationship with Bruce Wayne. The protocol's implementation was characterized by a technical precision that reflected years of contingency planning, organized around the understanding that this specific scenario, or something closely analogous to it, was always a possibility that the mission had to be prepared for. The explosive devices were placed according to calculations that had been verified through multiple independent assessments of the structural physics involved. The evidence was prepared to withstand forensic examination by the most sophisticated investigators that any relevant authority could deploy. The timing was calibrated to the specific circumstances that the revelation of Bruce Wayne's identity had created, chosen for the moment when the protocol's implementation would produce the maximum symbolic impact, while creating the minimum operational disruption for the systems that would need to continue functioning in its aftermath. What the protocol was actually designed to produce, beneath the technical specifications of staged destruction and manufactured evidence and the careful logistics of disappearance, was a story. Specifically, it was designed to produce the story that Batman had always needed the world to believe, and that Bruce Wayne's continued existence had always complicated the story that Batman was something beyond any individual person, that it could not be killed because it was not alive in the way that people were alive, that its continuing presence in the world did not depend on any particular person's survival. The staged death was not a deception designed to protect Bruce Wayne, though it would protect him. It was a piece of narrative architecture designed to convert what might otherwise have been understood as Batman's defeat into something that could be understood as his transformation, the point at which the individual became the institution, and the institution became the idea, and the idea became, as ideas do when they are sufficiently powerful and sufficiently embedded in the consciousness of the people among whom they operate, something that could not be destroyed by any available mechanism, because it was no longer locatable in any single destructible thing. The public reaction to the apparent death confirmed the success of the narrative architecture in ways that validated the protocol's core strategic logic, while also revealing something about Gotham that the protocol's designers had known was true, but that seeing it confirmed in the specific and visceral form of a city's collective grief was nonetheless affecting to observe. Gotham mourned Batman in the way that cities mourn the things they have come to define themselves through, with a completeness that reflected not simply affection for the individual who had been lost, but the specific anxiety of a population that had organized its sense of safety around an arrangement that the loss had now undermined. The mourning was real, which meant the need had been real, which meant the dependency had been real, which was simultaneously the vindication of what Batman had done, and the most damning evidence of what it had cost a city that could not imagine protecting itself, whose relationship with its own capacity for collective self-defense had been so thoroughly organized around the presence of a single, extraordinary individual that the individual's absence created something approaching collective helplessness. The emergence of new vigilante activity in the period following the protocol's implementation was the clearest demonstration that the narrative architecture had functioned as intended. People who had been inspired by Batman's example, who had absorbed the message that individuals with sufficient commitment and capability could take on the protection of the vulnerable without waiting for institutional authorization that might never arrive, began to act on that inspiration in ways that the individual's specific capabilities and circumstances permitted. These new actors were not Batman. They did not possess his resources or his training or the specific psychological formation that had made him what he was. What they possessed was the idea that he had demonstrated was possible, and the idea, proving itself transmissible in the way that powerful ideas are transmissible, was producing effects that did not require its original embodiment to persist. Whether the protocol represented a triumph or a tragedy was a question that the protocol's design had deliberately refused to answer, because answering it would have required making a judgment about the value of the thing that had been sacrificed in its implementation. And that judgment was the one that Bruce Wayne had never been able to make about his own existence with anything approaching objectivity. The sacrifice was real. A person had chosen to stop being a person, had converted the specific, irreplaceable consciousness that had experienced Crime Alley and Alfred's love and Jason's loss and everything else that had constituted the interior life of Bruce Wayne into an instrument of ascender. Narrative purpose had made of himself a story rather than continuing to be a person who had stories told about him. This was a loss of a kind that the protocol's tactical success could not compensate for, because tactical success operates in the domain of outcomes, and this was a loss in the domain of being, the permanent unavailability of the specific consciousness that had been Bruce Wayne, which would have been a loss regardless of what it produced. But the triumph was also real, the demonstration that something built from the raw material of one child's wound in one alley in one city's long history of institutional failure could become, through the specific exercise of extraordinary will and extraordinary resources, and something that resembled love, even when it was expressed through methods that love would not ordinarily authorize. Something that outlasted the individual who had built it, and that continued to shape the city that had made the building necessary. This was not nothing. It was, in fact, in the accounting of what one human life could produce, quite a lot. The question of whether it was worth what it cost was the question that Gotham, as a city, had never been willing to ask honestly about any of the arrangements through which it sustained itself, and the protocol was, in this sense, entirely consistent with the city that had made it necessary, an answer to a question that had not been asked, a solution to a problem that had not been honestly identified, a triumph achieved through means that the triumph's beneficiaries would never fully examine. The most depraved crime in Gotham's history was not the murder in Crime Alley, though the murder was terrible and real and permanent. It was not the institution that made monsters, though the institution made monsters with the regularity of a factory that had found its purpose. It was not the Joker's philosophical assault on the possibility of meaning, Though the assault was sophisticated and its effects were severe, it was not the scientists who converted healing into harm, or the man who was destroyed to prove a point, or the city that was converted into a laboratory, or the guardians who were broken by the burden of their guardianship. All of these were terrible. All of them were real. All of them deserve exactly the gravity with which this account has tried to examine them. The most depraved crime in Gotham's history was Gotham itself, the continuous, generational, entirely preventable production of conditions in which terrible things became not just possible, but probable. The maintenance of institutional arrangements whose primary function was the sustenance of those conditions for the benefit of the people who benefited from them. The systematic conversion of every effort to address the conditions into evidence that the conditions were natural rather than engineered, and inevitable rather than chosen. This was Gotham's crime, conducted across generations with a consistency that individual crimes could not match, producing consequences that accumulated in the specific persons of specific victims, without any of those persons being the full measure of what the crime had cost. And then there were the people who tried anyway, the James Gordons who remained honest longer than the institution rewarded honesty, the Alfreds who gave everything to something they loved, even when the giving cost them things that love should not cost, the Barbara Gordons who rebuilt themselves from the ruins of what had been done to them into something that the ruins alone would not have predicted, the ordinary residents of Gotham's most neglected neighborhoods who maintained community and dignity and human connection under conditions specifically designed to eliminate all three. The people who chose, in the specific and repeatable way that people in impossible circumstances choose, to be something other than what their circumstances were trying to make them. These people are Gotham's most important story, more important than its criminals or its institutional failures, or the extraordinary individuals who made extraordinary choices in the shadows of its worst tendencies. They are the story that Gotham's governance has always tried to obscure, because a city that produces people who resist it, despite everything the city has done to prevent that resistance, is a city that cannot maintain the fiction that its conditions are the only conditions possible, that its arrangements are natural rather than chosen, that the people they have damaged could not have become something different under different circumstances. They could have, they did. The proof is in every person who walked through Gotham's darkness and retained, in however damaged and compromised, a form, something recognizable as the person they had intended to be. And so we arrive at the end of our long walk through Gotham's darkness, through the crimes that the city committed, and the crimes that were committed within it, and the crimes that were committed by and against the people who tried to stand between Gotham and the worst of itself. We have walked through Crime Alley and the corridors of Arkham Asylum and the chemical depths of Ace Chemicals and the enclosed territory of a city within a city built as a laboratory for human suffering. We have examined the breaking of guardians and the corruption of scientists and the systematic dismantling of a child and the final act of a man who chose to become a story rather than continue to be a person. The question that was posed at the beginning of this journey, what was Gotham's most depraved crime, has been answered not with a single event, but with an understanding, which is the only honest form the answer could have taken. Gotham's most depraved crime was everything that made every other crime on this list possible, everything that made them probable, everything that converted the individual cruelties of individual actors into the expression of a city's deepest and most sustained commitment to arrangements that served the few at the expense of everyone else. But you survived the walk. You heard all of it and remained. This matters more than Gotham's worst tendencies, more than any individual horror or institutional failure, more than the most sophisticated philosophical challenge the Joker ever constructed. The capacity to witness terrible things clearly and remain capable of empathy, to hold the full weight of what human beings do to each other without losing sight of what they are also capable of choosing. This is the thing that Gotham's darkness was always trying to extinguish and never fully managed. 2. Rest now, fellow traveler. Let the gargoyles recede, and the rain-slicked streets grow quiet, and the distant sirens fade into something that is only the sound of a city that continues to exist despite everything it has done to make its own continuation undeserved. Let the darkness that we have walked through together become the darkness of peaceful sleep, which is a different kind of darkness, entirely the darkness of rest rather than the darkness of harm. The darkness of a mind releasing its grip on the day's weight, rather than the darkness of a city that has never fully decided what it wants to be. Gotham endures, so do its people. So, tonight, do you sleep well?